Hey there, night crew! Tonight we're cracking open one of history's most glorified and brutally misunderstood warrior societies, Sparta. You know, that place where Gerard Butler screamed about glory while showing off his abs in slow motion? Yeah, it turns out the real Sparta was somehow even more intense than the movies, just with way less hair gel and a lot more child abuse disguised as education. We're talking about a society that literally made poverty mandatory, turned dinner into a surveillance operation, and thought the best way to teach teenagers responsibility was to hand them a knife and say, "Go hunt some people." Before we dive into this beautiful disaster of a civilization, smash that like button if you're ready for some seriously dark history served with a side of ancient Greek dysfunction. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I love seeing how far this community reaches across the globe. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about what happens when an entire society decides that being reasonable is for losers. Tonight we're stripping away the Bronze Age propaganda and looking at Sparta as it actually was. Not a nation of noble warriors, but a paranoid police state running on slave labour and toxic masculinity. This is going to get weird. Let's go. Picture this. It's sometime around 400 BC, and the sun is just starting to peek over the Taygetus Mountains, casting long shadows across the Eurotas River Valley. In most Greek city-states, this would be the moment when merchants start setting up their stalls, when the smell of fresh bread begins wafting through the streets, when normal human beings engage in normal human activities like having breakfast with their families or complaining about the weather. But Sparta? Sparta wakes up like a military base, which makes sense because that's essentially what it was. An entire civilization cosplaying as boot camp for roughly 3 centuries straight. The first sounds you'd hear weren't roosters or children laughing or anything remotely wholesome. No, the dawn in Sparta announced itself with the sharp, penetrating notes of the aulos, a double-reed flute that sounds vaguely like an oboe having an existential crisis. These weren't gentle wake-up calls either. The flute players, who, naturally were performing a state-mandated civic duty, would march through the unpaved streets playing military tunes that had been drilled into every citizen's head since they were old enough to stand. It's the ancient world's version of a particularly aggressive alarm clock, except you can't hit snooze, and the snooze button wouldn't help anyway because your entire society has collectively decided that comfort is for weaklings. Now, while this musical alarm system echoed off the mountains, different groups of people responded in very different ways. And here's where things get interesting in that special Spartan way that makes you grateful you live in the 21st century. For the Spartiates, that's the full citizens, the elite warrior class that made up maybe 5 to 10% of the population. This dawn ritual marked another day in a life that had been regimented down to the minute since they were 7 years old. These men didn't wake up in their own homes, by the way. Most nights they slept in communal barracks with their age cohort, which is ancient Greek for the guys you've been stuck with since elementary school and will continue being stuck with until you're either dead or 60. Nothing says good morning. Quite like waking up surrounded by 24 other men who also haven't discovered deodorant yet. Though in fairness to the Spartans, nobody in the ancient world had discovered deodorant, so at least the suffering was egalitarian. But let's talk about what's happening in the households, or what passed for households in this peculiar society. Somewhere in one of those austere stone dwellings, a mother is preparing to do something that would haunt her for the rest of her life, though she's been conditioned to see it as her patriotic duty. Her son has just turned 7 years old. In Athens, a 7-year-old might be starting to learn his letters, maybe helping out in the family shop, definitely still sleeping under his parents' roof. In Sparta, 7 is the age when childhood ends with the finality of a door slamming shut. This morning, that little boy, let's call him Alexios, though it honestly doesn't matter what his name is because his individuality is about to be systematically crushed, will leave his mother's house for the last time as a child. Now the Spartans had a fancy term for this, the agog. It sounds almost nice in Greek, doesn't it? Educational, character building. What it actually meant was that little Alexios is being enrolled in what we might generously call military boarding school, and more accurately describe as state-sponsored child abuse with a syllabus. From this morning forward, he belongs to Sparta. Not to his family, not to himself, but to the state. His mother, who's been taught since her own girlhood that this is the highest honour she can give her city, will hand him over to the older boys and men who will now be responsible for transforming him into a weapon. She won't see him live at home again. She might catch glimpses of him at festivals, Watch him compete in athletic contests. But the cuddles are over, the bedtime stories are done, the concept of maternal comfort has just been filed under weaknesses we cannot afford. And here's the thing that really drives home how comprehensively weird Sparta was. This wasn't considered tragic. This was Tuesday. Every Spartiate family did this. Every mother let go. Every father nodded approvingly. Because if you didn't participate in this system, if you tried to keep your son at home past 7, you weren't just being a protective parent, you were betraying the entire social contract. You were telling your neighbours that you valued your individual family over the collective survival of the state, which in Sparta was approximately equivalent to spitting on the flag while setting fire to the constitution. Not exactly a career-boosting move. Meanwhile, as young Alexios is taking his last walk as a mama's boy, other parts of Spartan society are already in motion. The Helots, and we're going to talk about them a lot more later because their story is impossibly dark, are already out in the fields. These people, who made up the vast majority of the population, were essentially state-owned serfs tied to specific plots of land. They weren't technically slaves, which is one of those legal distinctions that matters immensely to lawyers and approximately 0% to the person being forced to work someone else's land. They worked the agricultural estates that supported the Spartiates, handing over roughly half of everything they produced, and they did this under surveillance that would make modern authoritarian regimes nod in approval. Here's something that should give you pause. The Helots were mostly Messenians, people from the region west of Sparta that the Spartans had conquered a couple centuries earlier. They weren't foreigners captured in some distant war and brought back as slaves, which was the more common model in ancient Greece. They were the original inhabitants of their own land, now forced to work it for the benefit of their conquerors while still living in their ancestral villages. Imagine being conquered and enslaved in your own hometown, and then your grandchildren are still enslaved in that same town, and their grandchildren, on and on. That was the Helot experience. They outnumbered the Spartiates by something like 7 or 8 to 1, which meant the entire Spartan system was built on top of a demographic powder keg that could theoretically explode at any moment. This is why the Spartans were so obsessively military. It wasn't because they were naturally brave or loved war or whatever the propaganda claimed. It was because they were terrified. They had built a society where a small elite lived off the labour of a massive subjugated population, and maintaining that arrangement required constant vigilance, regular intimidation, and a military so overwhelmingly superior that rebellion seemed pointless. The famous Spartan courage wasn't just courage, it was existential necessity. They couldn't afford to be weak because weakness would mean their entire society would collapse within a generation. Every sunrise brought another day of maintaining this impossible balancing act through sheer force of will and actual force. But back to our morning routine. As the flutes continue their wake-up call and the Helots head to the fields under watchful eyes, there's another group we need to talk about: Spartan women. And here's where things get complicated in ways that make modern observers tie themselves in knots, trying to figure out whether Sparta was progressive or oppressive, and the answer is, as it usually is with history, both, neither, and it depends on what you're measuring. Spartan girls weren't being torn from their mothers at 7. They stayed home, received their own education, and enjoyed a level of physical freedom that would have scandalized their Athenian counterparts. While Athenian women of the citizen class were expected to stay indoors, speak softly, and generally make themselves as invisible as possible, Spartan women were out in public, participating in athletics, training their bodies, and openly expressing opinions. They could own property, they could manage estates, they could mock men in public if those men had shown cowardice in battle, and this wasn't seen as inappropriate, it was seen as their civic duty. In a famous story, a Spartan woman hands her son his shield as he leaves for war, and tells him to come back either carrying it or being carried on it. That's not a sweet mother's blessing, that's a threat. Die in battle rather than retreat. The shield on your back or your corpse on the shield. No pressure, son. So on one hand, Spartan women had rights and freedoms that were genuinely unusual for ancient Greece. On the other hand, their entire purpose was still completely defined by the state's needs. They exercised to produce healthy babies. They managed property because their husbands were living in barracks. They were literate and educated because the state needed intelligent mothers to raise intelligent warriors. Their freedom was functional, not philosophical. They weren't free because Sparta believed in gender equality. They were free because a militaristic society that sent its men to live in barracks and potentially die in battle needed women who could run things in their absence. It's empowerment as pragmatism, not as principle. On this particular morning, Spartan girls might be heading out for their own physical training. Unlike the boys, they weren't being prepared for combat. Spartan women didn't fight in the phalanx, but they were being prepared to be mothers of warriors, which required them to be physically strong. There are accounts, probably exaggerated but telling nonetheless, of Spartan women exercising nude or nearly nude in public view, which other Greeks found absolutely shocking. The Spartans' reasoning was characteristically practical. How can you produce strong children if you're weak yourself? How can you teach your sons toughness if you're soft? The female body wasn't something to hide in shame, it was a tool that needed to be optimized for its state function. Not exactly body positivity in the modern sense, but definitely a different approach than women should be seen and not heard, and preferably not seen either. Now let's talk about where all this was actually happening, because if you were expecting the Sparta of popular imagination, gleaming marble temples, impressive fortifications, grand public buildings, you're going to be deeply disappointed. The Spartans had made an architectural choice that was either admirably principled or stupidly stubborn, depending on your perspective, and they stuck with it with the same bloody-minded determination they applied to everything else. Sparta had no walls. Not Sparta had walls that weren't very good. Not Sparta had walls that eventually crumbled. Sparta deliberately chose not to build defensive walls around their city. This wasn't an oversight or a budget issue. It was a philosophical statement. The story goes that when someone asked the Spartan king Agesilaus why Sparta had no walls, he pointed to his citizens and said, "These are the walls of Sparta," which is a fantastic comeback that probably made everyone in earshot nod appreciatively, while secretly thinking, yes, but also actual walls would be good though, right? This decision makes more sense, or at least makes a kind of sense, when you understand what Sparta actually looked like. This wasn't a city in the way we think of cities, or even in the way the Greeks thought of cities. Most Greek polis had an urban centre, an acropolis, a marketplace that served as the social and commercial heart of the community. Sparta was more like a cluster of villages that agreed to call themselves a city-state. It sprawled across the valley in a way that was more suburban than urban, except without the suburbs or the urban parts. Just scattered settlements connected by a shared identity, and a road network that would make modern civil engineers weep. The architecture itself was aggressively, almost militantly simple. While Athenians were covering their temples in intricate sculptures and their public buildings in marble, Spartans were building with rough-cut stone and timber. Not because they couldn't afford better. Sparta controlled massive agricultural territories worked by those helots we mentioned, but because they had convinced themselves that architectural beauty was a sign of moral weakness. Luxury corrupted. Decoration distracted. Beauty bred softness. Therefore their buildings were functional boxes that accomplished their purpose and nothing more. It's like if the brutalist architectural movement of the 1960s had happened in ancient Greece, and also been deeply paranoid about its citizens developing aesthetic sensibilities. The temples to the gods were there, because you had to have temples. The gods would get annoyed otherwise, and annoyed gods were bad for business. But these weren't the soaring marble masterpieces you'd find in Athens or Delphi. Spartan temples were modest stone structures that met the minimum requirements for divine appeasement. The message was clear: even the gods should appreciate functionality over form. One imagines the gods themselves looking down at these austere little buildings and thinking, well, I suppose it's the thought that counts, but would it have killed you to spring for some columns? The public buildings followed the same pattern. The Gerousia, where the Council of Elders met to make important decisions, wasn't housed in some impressive government complex. It was a plain building that could have been mistaken for a particularly large storage shed. The ephors, the 5 annually elected officials who wielded enormous power, worked out of facilities that would fail any modern workplace inspection for completely lacking in natural light and basic comfort. There were no theatres for dramatic performances because drama was Athenian decadence. There was no grand gymnasium for philosophy, because philosophy as Athens practiced it, sitting around asking annoying questions about the nature of reality, was seen as time-wasting navel-gazing. If you wanted to exercise, you did so in an open field with minimal equipment. If you wanted to think, you thought about warfare and civic duty. That's it. Those are your options. Private homes were even more extreme in their simplicity. Spartan houses were famously indistinguishable from one another. There was no keeping up with the Joneses because the Joneses' house looked exactly like yours, and if yours looked better, you'd be investigated for getting too wealthy, which would raise uncomfortable questions about whether you were properly participating in the communal system. The homes were small, single-story structures with minimal rooms. Remember, the men weren't really living there anyway. They were in the barracks most of the time. These were places where women managed households and raised children until those children were old enough to be absorbed into the state system. They weren't homes in the emotional sense we understand. They were processing centres for the next generation of warriors and warrior mothers. The lack of luxury extended to furnishings. Spartans were famous, or notorious, depending on who was telling the story, for their furniture. Specifically for how terrible it was. The legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, the semi-mythical figure who supposedly established all of Sparta's institutions, had allegedly decreed that houses should be built using only axes and saws, with no fancy tools allowed. The result was rough-hewn furniture that was aggressively uncomfortable. Beds were deliberately hard. Chairs were basic wooden structures that prioritized stability over comfort. The idea was that if you got too comfortable in your own home, you might become soft. Better to be slightly miserable all the time so that military campaigns wouldn't seem comparatively worse. Now you might be thinking, surely the wealthy Spartans had nicer stuff in private, right? They just kept it hidden from public view? And here's where the Spartan system really showed its teeth. They had an economic setup specifically designed to make that impossible. The Spartans used iron currency, not iron coins, iron bars. Huge, unwieldy iron rods that were deliberately made worthless by being heated and then quenched in vinegar to make them brittle. You couldn't use these outside Sparta because nobody else wanted them. You couldn't accumulate serious wealth because storing enough iron bars to represent real value would require a warehouse. It was currency designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth, which is either brilliantly egalitarian or catastrophically stupid depending on whether you think economic growth is important for a society's survival. Spoiler alert, it is, and Sparta's economy was basically frozen in place for centuries. Gold and silver were forbidden, not just discouraged, actually illegal. If you were caught with precious metals, you faced serious consequences. This meant that the beautiful art, the fine craftsmanship, the luxury goods that other Greek cities imported and exported, none of that could flow into or out of Sparta. You couldn't be a merchant because what would you trade with? You couldn't develop industries because you couldn't sell products abroad. The entire economy was based on agriculture worked by helots, with the Spartiates living off the fixed amounts of food their assigned land produced. It was a closed loop that actively resisted any form of economic development. This economic primitivism had a direct impact on what the city looked like. There were no artisan quarters because there were no artisans. There were no markets full of exotic goods because there were no exotic goods. There were no wealthy neighbourhoods and poor neighbourhoods because everyone was living in approximately the same level of austere simplicity, at least among the Spartiates. The Peruchoi, the free non-citizens who lived in surrounding areas, handled what little commerce and craft production existed, but they were very much second-class citizens who existed to support the system without participating in its benefits. Walking through Sparta, you would have been struck by what wasn't there. No grand monuments commemorating military victories, which is wild for a society that defined itself through military success. The Spartans believed that their best monuments were their enemies' memories of defeat. Why build a statue when you can just have every other Greek city-state flinch when they hear your name? It's psychological warfare as urban planning. Other cities built victory monuments to remind themselves of their greatness. Sparta didn't build monuments because they considered their reputation sufficient, and also because monuments might make people complacent, and complacency led to softness, and softness led to defeat. Better to stay hungry and paranoid. The public spaces reflected this same aesthetic of calculated minimalism. The agora, the central marketplace and gathering place that was the beating heart of most Greek cities, existed in Sparta but was notably bare. In Athens, the agora was surrounded by colonnades, filled with shops, bustling with philosophical debates and commercial activity. In Sparta, it was essentially an empty plaza where you could assemble if necessary but otherwise had no real reason to linger. There was nothing to buy. There were no philosophers setting up shop to discuss ethics. It was functional space awaiting function, like a parking lot without the cars. This architectural austerity served multiple purposes beyond just the obvious "we're tough and don't need fancy things" messaging. It was a form of social control. In a city where every building looks basically the same, where there's no accumulation of visible wealth, where even the homes of the most distinguished warriors are indistinguishable from those of average citizens, it becomes very difficult to develop class consciousness based on material conditions. Everyone can see that everyone else lives in the same simple way. This creates a sense of solidarity, sure, but it also makes it harder to imagine alternatives. If you've never seen luxury, if you've been told since childhood that comfort is weakness, if the physical environment around you constantly reinforces the message that simplicity equals virtue, you're less likely to question the system. The city layout itself was designed with military function in mind, though calling it designed might be generous. It was more like organic military-adjacent sprawl. The various settlements that made up Greater Sparta were positioned to control the Eurotas Valley and maintain watch over the Helot populations. Roads connected these settlements in ways that prioritized rapid military movement over commercial convenience. There was no city centre in the traditional sense because the Spartans didn't really believe in centralization beyond the military and political structures. They were scattered because concentration would have required urban infrastructure, and urban infrastructure would have required economic development, and economic development would have meant trade, and trade would have meant contact with foreigners. And their corrupting ideas about things like comfort and having choices. The lack of walls, meanwhile, remained a point of pride and also a massive strategic vulnerability that Sparta managed to get away with through sheer military intimidation. For a surprisingly long time, the argument was that walls made you defensive-minded, that they encouraged you to hide behind fortifications rather than meet your enemies in open battle. Real men didn't need walls. They needed courage and discipline and a phalanx formation. This worked wonderfully as propaganda and terribly as actual defensive doctrine. Sparta's enemies couldn't easily attack them, not because Sparta was well defended, but because Sparta's army was scary enough that most people decided attacking wasn't worth the trouble. The religious architecture provides an interesting window into Spartan priorities. The temples existed, as mentioned, but they weren't the showpieces of civic pride that you'd find elsewhere. The Spartans worshipped the same gods as other Greeks, but with their own particular emphasis. Artemis and Apollo got significant attention, which makes sense for a society focused on youth training and martial values. But even the cults had a military flavour. The festival of Artemis Orthia involved boys being whipped at the altar to prove their endurance, religious observance as sadistic spectator sport. This wasn't worship in the sense of communion with the divine, it was worship as another form of training and selection. Can you stand at an altar and take a beating without crying out? Congratulations, you've proven yourself worthy of the goddess's favour, and also demonstrated to your peers that you're sufficiently tough. 2 birds, 1 very painful stone. The gymnasium spaces, such as they were, reflected the same no-frills approach. These weren't the elaborate athletic facilities you'd find in other Greek cities, with their covered running tracks and bathing areas and spaces for relaxation. Spartan training grounds were open fields with minimal equipment. Wrestling happened in dirt pits, running happened on whatever terrain was available. The point wasn't to create comfortable spaces for athletic development, it was to prepare bodies for the discomfort of warfare. Why train on a comfortable track when you'll be fighting in mud and rocks? Why wrestle on a nice sand floor when battle will happen wherever it happens? The training environment was deliberately harsh as preparation for a harsh reality. Even the communal dining halls, the Syssitia, which we'll discuss more later, were architecturally unremarkable. These were simple buildings with communal tables where citizen soldiers ate together daily. They weren't feast halls with high ceilings and decorative elements. They were rooms with tables and benches, places where the function of communal eating could occur without any distraction from unnecessary aesthetics. The building said, "This is where you eat together, where you're reminded of your bonds to your fellow soldiers, where you prove you can contribute your share to the communal meal." The architecture didn't need to say anything else. This brings us to a question that probably seems obvious by now but is worth stating explicitly. What was Sparta trying to accomplish with this aggressive architectural minimalism? The answer goes beyond simple austerity or even practical military focus. Sparta was engaged in a constant battle against time and change. The system they'd created, this weird, rigid, militaristic society, was fundamentally unstable. It required every generation to buy into the same values, to maintain the same discipline, to resist the temptation to evolve or adapt. Any change, any softening, any allowance for individual expression or material accumulation could potentially unravel the entire structure. The architecture was part of the enforcement mechanism. By keeping everything simple, by making the physical environment constantly reinforce the values of austerity and equality, the Spartans were trying to create a society that couldn't easily change. If there were no beautiful buildings to aspire to build, no luxuries to aspire to acquire, no visible hierarchy in the constructed environment, then each generation would grow up accepting that this is just how things are and always have been. The built environment was propaganda made manifest in stone and timber. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This strategy only works if you can completely isolate your population from alternatives, and Sparta couldn't do that. Spartans travelled for wars and festivals. They saw Athens with its Parthenon. They saw Corinth with its prosperity. They saw what other Greeks were building and creating and enjoying. And yet they returned home to their deliberately ugly city and pretended this was superior. The cognitive dissonance must have been remarkable. You'd come back from seeing the wonders of the Greek world and walk into your plain stone house with its uncomfortable furniture and iron currency, and you'd have to convince yourself that you were the lucky one, that those other Greeks with their art and philosophy and comfortable chairs were the ones who had it wrong. This gets at something fundamental about Sparta's entire project. They weren't just building a military society. They were building a society that required constant effort to maintain against all external pressures and internal logic. Every day, every citizen had to actively participate in maintaining the illusion that this way of life was not just necessary but superior. The architecture wasn't just ugly out of necessity or even principle. It was ugly as an act of will, a daily reminder that comfort was weakness and that the collective was everything. As the sun rose higher over Laconia on this particular morning, as young Alexios took his last steps toward childhood's end, as the Helots bent to their labour in the fields, as the Spartiate warriors assembled for another day of training, the city itself stood as a testament to a particular kind of human stubbornness. Here was a society that had looked at everything that makes life pleasant and interesting: art, commerce, philosophy, comfort, individual expression, and had deliberately rejected all of it in favour of a single-minded focus on military power and social control. The buildings, or rather the deliberate simplicity of the buildings, were part of that rejection. They were anti-architecture, spaces designed to not inspire, to not comfort, to not do anything except provide the bare minimum of shelter and function. And for a while, for a surprisingly long while actually, it worked. The Spartan system maintained itself for centuries through this combination of military excellence, social pressure, and architectural reinforcement of values. But systems built on total rigidity and total rejection of change have a funny way of eventually collapsing, usually catastrophically. The sunrise over Sparta brought another day of discipline, another day of maintaining the impossible balance, another day of pretending that living in an intentionally uncomfortable city, with intentionally uncomfortable furniture while sitting on a potential slave revolt, was the height of Greek civilization. The flutes continued to play, the helots continued to work, the boys continued to be separated from their mothers, the women continued their training. And Sparta continued to be Sparta, frozen in amber by its own ideology, maintained through sheer force of will and the constant threat of violence. The architecture reflected all of this: the military function, the rejection of luxury, the emphasis on collective over individual, the prioritization of ideology over comfort. It was a built environment that told you exactly what the society valued, and more importantly, what it feared. And what it feared most was change, was softness, was the possibility that someone might look at this system and ask, wait, why are we doing it this way again? But nobody asked that question. Not yet. Not this morning. The sun climbed higher, the day progressed, and Sparta ground forward in its peculiar mechanical way, a society that had confused rigidity with strength, and would eventually discover that those are not the same thing. For now, though, the system held, the flutes played, the march continued. And somewhere in one of those identical houses, a mother tried not to cry as she watched her 7-year-old son walk away forever, telling herself that this was honour, this was duty, this was what made Sparta great. The architecture around her offered no comfort, which was, after all, exactly the point. Now, after our morning wake-up call has echoed through the valley, and everyone has been reminded of their place in this peculiar social machine, it's time to address one of the most important questions about daily life in ancient Sparta. What did these people eat? And more specifically, what did they eat for breakfast? Because if you thought the architecture was aggressively uncomfortable, wait until you hear about the cuisine. Let's start with the most infamous dish in Spartan history, possibly in all of Greek history, and definitely in the running for worst breakfast option in recorded civilization, black broth, or as the Spartans called it, melas zomos. Now when you hear black broth, you might picture something like a rich beef consommé that's been reduced down to concentrate its flavours, maybe served at a fancy French restaurant with a tiny garnish and an oversized price tag. You would be catastrophically wrong. Spartan black broth was essentially liquid suffering served in a bowl, and the recipe tells you everything you need to know about Spartan values. Here's what went into this culinary masterpiece. Pork blood. Vinegar. Salt. That's it. That's the recipe. Boil some pork, collect the blood, add vinegar and salt, presumably to both preserve it and make it even less pleasant to consume. Some accounts mention that they might have thrown in some pork meat as well, which would at least give you something to chew on, but the core ingredient was blood. Not blood sausage, where the blood is mixed with grains and spices and stuffed into casings and actually transformed into something resembling food. Just blood, vinegar, and salt. It's less a recipe and more a philosophical statement about the nature of existence. Now, before we go further, we need to understand something important. This wasn't prison food. This wasn't what you ate when times were hard and the harvest had failed. This was the standard breakfast for Spartiate citizens, the elite warrior class who owned land and helots, and had, theoretically, access to better options. They ate this by choice, or rather, they ate this because their society had collectively decided that eating anything better would be a sign of weakness, which when you think about it is choosing to eat it, just with extra steps and peer pressure. The cultural logic went something like this. Real strength comes from being able to tolerate discomfort. Pleasure weakens you. Therefore, deliberately making your meals unpleasant builds character. It's the ancient Greek equivalent of those modern wellness influencers who drink celery juice at 5 a.m. and act like it's changed their life. Except instead of celery juice, it's blood vinegar, and instead of Instagram likes, you get social acceptance in. A militaristic society that might literally ostracize you if you complain about the food. Not exactly the same stakes, but you see the parallel. There's a famous story, possibly apocryphal but too good not to share, about a foreign visitor to Sparta who was invited to dine with the citizens and was served the black broth. After one taste, he reportedly said something to the effect of, "Now I understand why Spartans are so willing to die in battle." With food like this, life doesn't seem particularly worth living. The Spartans, characteristically, took this as a compliment. Yes, exactly. Our food is so terrible that death holds no fear for us. We've already experienced worse than anything an enemy can do. It's the ultimate psychological warfare applied to breakfast. But here's where it gets interesting from an anthropological perspective. The black broth wasn't just about toughening up the individual Spartans. It was about maintaining equality and preventing the kind of culinary one-upmanship that could lead to social stratification. In other Greek cities, wealthy citizens could afford elaborate meals, exotic ingredients, skilled cooks. They could host impressive dinner parties that demonstrated their status and taste. In Sparta, everyone ate the same terrible food. The richest Spartiate ate black broth. The poorest Spartiate ate black broth. Even the kings ate black broth, though they allegedly got double portions, which is like winning the booby prize twice. This enforced culinary equality served multiple functions. First, it eliminated food as a status symbol. You couldn't show off your wealth through elaborate meals because elaborate meals weren't allowed. Second, it created a shared experience of mild suffering that bonded the citizens together. Everyone was equally miserable at breakfast, which created solidarity in the same way that complaining about the weather or bad management brings co-workers together. Third, it physically reinforced the message that Spartans were different from other Greeks. You couldn't develop refined taste because refinement wasn't available. You learned to appreciate, or at least tolerate, simplicity because simplicity was all you got. The preparation of the black broth itself was apparently something of an art form, though art might be too generous a word. The older men, the ones who had been eating this stuff for decades and had presumably destroyed their taste buds to the point where nothing registered anymore, were considered the experts. They would oversee the preparation, making sure the proportions were correct, the consistency appropriate. There was apparently a proper way to make blood soup, and deviating from it was frowned upon. Which raises the question, if you're going to eat something this unpleasant anyway, why does it matter if it's prepared correctly? But Spartan's gonna Spartan, and if they're going to suffer through breakfast, they're going to suffer through it the traditional way, exactly as their ancestors did. The actual consumption of the black broth took place in the context of the syssitia, those communal dining groups we touched on earlier. Every Spartiate citizen belonged to one of these groups, usually about 15 men who ate together daily. The meals happened in simple communal halls, and everyone was required to contribute their share of food from their land allotment. The black broth was typically served alongside barley bread, cheese and figs, finally something that sounds vaguely edible. But the broth was the centerpiece, the dish that defined the meal. Here's a detail that really drives home the strangeness of Spartan food culture. Visitors to Sparta who were invited to the syssitia were often shocked not just by the food itself, but by the Spartans' genuine appreciation for it. The Spartans weren't grimacing through their meals, forcing down food they hated. They'd been conditioned from childhood to associate this taste with home, with tradition, with being Spartan. They'd learned to love it, or at least to convincingly pretend to love it, which amounts to the same thing socially. It's remarkable what human beings can learn to accept as normal when it's presented as not just normal, but virtuous. The breakfast itself was deliberately not a leisurely affair. This wasn't brunch with unlimited mimosas and a nice view. You ate your allotted portion, you ate it relatively quickly, and then you went about your business. The entire meal was structured to minimize pleasure and maximize function. Food was fuel. The body needed sustenance to train and fight. Breakfast provided that sustenance in the most efficient, least enjoyable way possible. Mission accomplished. But let's talk about what this diet actually did to people physically, because while the Spartans were legendary warriors, they were also eating a breakfast that was basically flavoured blood water. The dish was probably reasonably nutritious. Blood is high in iron and protein. The pork would have provided additional protein and fat. The vinegar might have helped with preservation and digestion. But it couldn't have been pleasant on the digestive system, especially first thing in the morning. One imagines there was a reason Spartan military formations maintained strict discipline about staying in line, and it wasn't just about military cohesion. The contrast with other Greek cities makes the Spartan breakfast even more remarkable. In Athens, the morning meal might include bread dipped in wine, honey, olives, fresh cheese. Nothing fancy by modern standards, but recognizably pleasant food that a human being might actually enjoy eating. In prosperous Greek colonies, you might add fresh fruit, maybe some fish. The point is, breakfast elsewhere in the Greek world was at least trying to be pleasant. Sparta looked at breakfast and decided it should be a character test that happened daily. Why make one major life decision to join a cult of austerity when you could make that decision 3 times a day at every meal? Now the black broth was famous, or infamous, enough that it became a symbol of Spartan culture throughout the Greek world. Other Greeks made jokes about it. It appeared in comedy plays. Philosophers used it as an example when discussing the relationship between pleasure and virtue. The Spartans, true to form, seemed to take pride in being the butt of these jokes. Yes, our food is terrible, but we're tough enough to eat it, which makes us better than you with your fancy Athenian cuisine. It's the ancient equivalent of those people who post about their 4 a.m. workout routine and their restrictive diet on social media, except instead of social media it was actual social interactions, and instead of humble bragging they were just regular bragging about how much they could suffer. But here's something that often gets overlooked. The black broth breakfast was just one component of a broader Spartan approach to food that was equally bizarre. The Spartans had rules about everything related to eating. You couldn't eat alone. That was antisocial and suspicious. You couldn't eat too much. Gluttony was weakness. You couldn't eat fancy food. Luxury was corrupting. But you also couldn't eat too little. That suggested you couldn't provide your share to the syssitia, which would mark you as poor and potentially get you kicked out of the citizen class. It was a narrow corridor of acceptable eating behaviour, and straying from it in either direction had serious social consequences. The wine situation at these breakfasts was similarly controlled. Spartans drank wine because this was ancient Greece and everyone drank wine. water being frequently unsafe and wine being effectively a dietary staple. But Spartan wine service was characteristically austere. It was mixed with water. Everyone did this, but Spartans probably used a higher water ratio. It was served in plain cups without decoration, and crucially, drinking too much was seen as shameful. There are stories of Spartans forcing helots to get drunk at festivals so that young Spartans could see how pathetic drunkenness looked and be deterred from excess. Yes, they used enslaved people as cautionary tales about the dangers of alcohol, which tells you a lot about Spartan morality, none of it good. The food system also had to accommodate the reality of Spartan military life. Remember, the men were living in barracks most of the time, not at home with their families. The communal meals weren't just cultural tradition, they were logistical necessity. You had hundreds of men who needed to be fed, and you needed to do it in a way that reinforced military discipline and social bonds. The black broth breakfast served that purpose. Everyone suffered through the same unpleasant meal together, which built camaraderie in the way that shared hardship does. It's like being in a terrible job with co-workers you complain with. You bond over the mutual misery. Now let's talk about what happened if you couldn't keep up with this system, because this is where the food culture intersects with Sparta's larger economic structure, in ways that were brutally effective at maintaining social control. Each Spartiate was required to contribute a specific amount of food to his syssitia. This came from the land he'd been allotted when he reached full citizenship, land that was worked by helots who handed over a portion of their harvest. If your land didn't produce enough, or if your helots rebelled or died or escaped, or if you just mismanaged your agricultural resources, you couldn't make your contributions, and if you couldn't make your contributions, you were out. Kicked out of the syssitia, which meant kicked out of the citizen class, which meant becoming a hypomaion, literally inferior, a person with fewer rights, no political voice, no place in the military system that defined Spartan identity. This brings us naturally, well, as naturally as anything in Sparta can be said to happen, to the topic of Spartan economics, which was possibly even stranger than their cuisine. Most societies throughout history have figured out that trade and commerce are good things. They allow specialization, which increases efficiency. They allow the exchange of goods and ideas. They create wealth. They foster innovation. The Spartans looked at all of this and said, "No thank you, we'll create an economic system that actively prevents all of that." And then they did, and they stuck with it for centuries, which is either admirably principled or spectacularly stupid, depending on your perspective and how much you value economic development. The centerpiece of Spartan economic weirdness was their currency. Actually, let's back up. Calling it currency is being generous. Other Greek cities used silver coins, lightweight and portable, easily stored, widely accepted for trade throughout the Mediterranean world. The Spartans used iron, not iron coins, iron bars. Long, heavy, deliberately cumbersome iron rods that they called oboloi. And here's the brilliant or insane part. They deliberately made these bars worthless outside Sparta. The process went like this. They'd forge iron bars, heat them until they were red hot, then quench them in vinegar. This made the iron brittle and useless for any actual purpose, like, say, making tools or weapons. The bars were valuable only because Spartans agreed they were valuable, and only within Sparta's borders. It was fiat currency taken to an absurd extreme. At least modern fiat currency is lightweight and portable. Spartan currency was engineered to be as inconvenient as possible. Think about the implications of this system for a moment. Let's say you're a wealthy Spartiate, and yes, some were wealthier than others despite the rhetoric of equality. You own productive land, your helots are efficient workers, you've got agricultural surplus. In any other Greek city, you'd convert that surplus into silver, store it compactly, maybe use it to buy luxury goods or invest in commercial ventures. In Sparta, you'd have to convert it into iron bars. How many iron bars would represent significant wealth? Dozens? Hundreds? Each bar was several feet long and weighed multiple pounds. You'd need a warehouse just to store your savings. And what could you do with this wealth? Nothing, really. You couldn't buy luxury goods because luxury goods were illegal. You couldn't invest in commercial ventures because commerce was discouraged. You couldn't even easily take it with you if you travelled because, again, these were massive iron bars that nobody outside Sparta wanted. This system was brilliant at accomplishing its intended purpose, preventing the accumulation and display of wealth. You physically could not become ostentatiously rich because there was no way to ostentatiously display iron bars. You couldn't wear your wealth as jewellery. Gold and silver were forbidden. You couldn't decorate your house with it. Everyone's house was supposed to look the same. You couldn't use it to buy political influence through lavish gifts or bribes. What are you going to do, show up with a cart full of iron bars? Here, accept this bribe of several £100 of deliberately useless metal? The sheer impracticality of the currency prevented most of the social ills associated with wealth inequality. But, and this is a huge but, it also completely stagnated the economy. Trade requires portable, universally accepted currency. The Spartans didn't have that. This meant that trade with other Greek cities was difficult to impossible. Sure, you could theoretically barter, exchange agricultural goods directly for other goods, but that's wildly inefficient compared to using money. It limits your trading partners to people who want exactly what you're selling and are selling exactly what you want. Economics professors call this the coincidence of wants problem, and every society that's moved beyond subsistence living has solved it by inventing money that actually works. Sparta deliberately chose not to solve this problem. They weren't primitive people who hadn't figured out money yet. They knew about silver coinage. Everyone in Greece used it. They chose to use terrible money instead, because terrible money served their social goals better than good money would have. It's like if a modern country decided to use boulders as currency. Technically possible, sends a strong message about valuing stability over convenience, absolutely catastrophic for economic growth. The ban on gold and silver extended beyond just currency. Spartans weren't supposed to own these precious metals in any form. If you were caught with gold or silver, you could face serious punishment. This created a situation where Spartans couldn't easily participate in the wider Greek economy. They couldn't hire skilled artisans from other cities who wanted payment in silver. They couldn't import luxury goods, not that they wanted to, officially, but the economic barrier reinforced the cultural prohibition. They couldn't send traders abroad because those traders would have no way to conduct business. The entire system was designed to keep Sparta economically isolated from the rest of the Greek world. This isolation had predictable effects. Without trade, you don't get the exchange of ideas that comes with trade. Without merchants, you don't get the cosmopolitan perspective that merchants develop. Without the ability to import goods, you don't get exposed to innovations happening elsewhere. Sparta's economy became fossilized, locked into an agricultural model that hadn't changed since the Archaic period. While other Greek cities were developing sophisticated financial instruments, building commercial empires, innovating in technology and art and philosophy, Sparta was stubbornly insisting that iron bars and black broth represented the peak of human achievement. The actual economic base of Spartan society was remarkably simple: agriculture. The Spartiates owned plots of land called kleroi. These plots were worked by helots, who were required to hand over approximately half of what they produced. Some sources say it was a fixed amount rather than a percentage, which would be either more or less oppressive depending on how good the harvest was. The Spartiate received food from his land, contributed a portion to his syssitia, kept the rest for his household. That was it. That was the entire economic relationship. No commerce, no industry, no complexity. The peroikoi, the free non-citizens living in towns around Sparta, handled what little craft production and trade existed. They made weapons, armour, basic tools, pottery. They could engage in commerce to some degree, though they were still subject to Spartan laws and culture. But they occupied a strange middle ground, free enough to work and trade, not free enough to have political rights or social prestige. They were the economic support system that allowed the Spartiates to focus entirely on being warriors, but they were also second-class citizens whose existence the Spartiates only grudgingly acknowledged. This brings us to one of the great contradictions of Spartan economics. They despised commerce and trade. They made accumulation of wealth practically impossible. They enforced rigid equality among citizens, but they were utterly dependent on massive economic inequality. The helots, who did all the actual productive work, got maybe half of what they produced. The Spartiates, who didn't work the land at all, got the other half or more. This isn't equality, this is exploitation. But it was exploitation of people who didn't count as citizens, so it didn't violate the principle of equality among Spartiates. It's the same mental gymnastics that allowed American founding fathers to write, "All men are created equal," while owning slaves. The equality only applies to the in-group. Everyone else is conveniently defined as outside the moral community. The land distribution system itself was supposedly egalitarian. When a Spartiate reached full citizenship, he was allotted a kleros of roughly equal size to other kleroi. This ensured that all citizens started from a similar economic position. But over time, this system broke down. Land could be inherited by daughters as well as sons. Some families had more surviving children than others. Some kleroi were more productive than others. Some Spartiates managed their resources better than others. Gradually, wealth inequality crept back in, though it remained much less pronounced than in other Greek cities. Still, by the classical period, you had some Spartiates who were genuinely struggling to make their Syssitia contributions, while others had land holdings that generated significant surplus. This wealth inequality had political consequences that we'll discuss more later, but it's worth noting here because it shows the fundamental tension in the Spartan system. They wanted equality and hierarchy simultaneously. They wanted everyone to be the same, but they also wanted a clear distinction between citizens and non-citizens, between Spartiates and Perioikoi and Helots. They wanted economic stagnation to prevent corruption, but they needed economic productivity to support a full-time warrior class. These contradictions were built into the system from the beginning, and they eventually contributed to its collapse. The Spartan attitude toward wealth was deeply conflicted. On one hand, they claimed to despise it. Luxury was weakness. Material accumulation was corrupting. The good Spartiate cared only for honour and duty, not for possessions. On the other hand, they were obsessed with preventing other Spartiates from becoming wealthier than them. The iron bar currency, the restrictions on trade, the laws against gold and silver, all of these suggest a society deeply anxious about wealth inequality, which implies that they actually cared quite a lot about wealth, just in a negative way. They were like people who claim they don't care about status while constantly monitoring everyone else's status markers to make sure nobody's getting ahead. There's a famous anecdote about a Spartan being asked why they use such unwieldy currency. His response was along the lines of, "So that we can't accumulate wealth easily or hide it away," which is honest. You have to give them that. But it's also admitting that the entire currency system is deliberately inefficient, designed to handicap the economy. Imagine if modern governments said, "We're switching to refrigerators as currency because they're hard to move and expensive to store, which will prevent wealth accumulation." You'd question their sanity. But the Spartans did essentially this and maintained the system for centuries. The economic system also tied directly into the political system through the Syssitia contributions we mentioned earlier. Your economic productivity determined your ability to remain a full citizen. If your land failed, if your helots rebelled, if you mismanaged your resources, you fell out of the citizen class. This created a perverse incentive structure. You were supposed to despise wealth, but you also needed to maintain enough economic production to keep your citizenship. You couldn't care too much about money, but you couldn't care too little either. It's like telling someone they need to exercise regularly but must never enjoy it or think about it. Technically possible, probably sustainable for some people, definitely psychologically weird. The Spartan economy also had no real mechanism for growth or innovation. In other Greek cities, successful merchants could accumulate capital and invest it in new ventures. Craftsmen could innovate, create better products, expand their operations. Philosophers and inventors could find wealthy patrons to support their work. None of this happened in Sparta. You couldn't be a successful merchant because commerce was restricted. You couldn't be an innovative craftsman because Spartan culture valued traditional methods and simple products. You couldn't be a philosopher because philosophy was seen as Athenian navel-gazing. The economy was locked into a steady state, producing the same things in the same ways generation after generation. This economic conservatism was, once again, deliberate. Innovation means change. Change might disrupt the social order. Therefore, innovation is dangerous. Better to stick with what works, even if what works is barely working and definitely not working as well as it could. The Spartans looked at the dynamic economies of Athens and Corinth and saw corruption and softness. They saw people getting rich through trade and thought this was somehow morally inferior to getting rich through owning land worked by enslaved people, which is quite the moral blind spot. They saw philosophical and artistic innovation and thought this was decadent distraction from the serious business of being warriors. The result was predictable: economic stagnation. While Athens became the economic powerhouse of the Aegean, while Corinth's merchants traded across the Mediterranean, while Syracuse built a commercial empire, Sparta's economy remained essentially unchanged. They had agriculture worked by helots, Minimal craft production by perioikoi, no significant trade, no financial innovation, no economic growth. They were frozen in time economically, which they saw as a feature, not a bug. The rest of Greece moved forward. Sparta stood still, proud of standing still, convinced that standing still was actually superior to moving forward. But here's the thing about standing still in a changing world. Eventually the world moves on without you. The Spartan economy worked, barely, as long as they controlled Messenia and had enough helots to work the land. When they lost Messenia in the 4th century BC, they lost half their economic base. And because they'd never developed alternative economic structures, they had no way to adapt. They couldn't suddenly become merchants. They had no experience with trade and their cultural values opposed it. They couldn't become craftsmen. Generations of warriors don't instantly develop artisan skills. They were economically inflexible because they'd spent centuries building an economy designed specifically to resist change. The breakfast of black broth and the currency of iron bars were both symptoms of the same fundamental Spartan characteristic: the willingness to accept inefficiency and discomfort in service of ideology. Most societies optimize for some combination of prosperity, pleasure, and security. Sparta optimized exclusively for security, specifically security against internal revolt and external attack, and was willing to sacrifice prosperity and pleasure entirely to achieve it. They ate terrible food and used terrible money because terrible food and terrible money served their larger goal of maintaining a militaristic society that could keep the helots suppressed and foreign enemies at bay. And for several centuries this actually worked. The system held together. The citizens ate their black broth, used their iron bars, contributed to their syssitia, trained for war, and maintained control over a hostile population that vastly outnumbered them. It's a testament to human adaptability that people can build and maintain such a deliberately uncomfortable system. But it's also a warning about the limitations of rigidity. Systems that cannot adapt eventually break, usually catastrophically. Sparta's economy, like its society, was strong but brittle. It could withstand tremendous pressure as long as conditions remained relatively constant, but it couldn't bend, couldn't evolve, couldn't respond to changing circumstances. The sun continued to rise over the Eurotas Valley, as it had for centuries and would for centuries more. The Spartiates continued to wake in their barracks, eat their black broth, count their iron bars, and congratulate themselves on their superior virtue. And all the while, the rest of the Greek world was innovating, trading, growing, changing, leaving Sparta increasingly isolated, not just economically, but culturally and politically. But that realization was still far off. For now, breakfast was served, contributions were made, the system ground forward in its peculiar mechanical way, and everyone agreed that this was not just necessary but good, not just acceptable, but superior. The black broth tasted of tradition. The iron bars weighed heavy with meaning, and if anyone thought this was all slightly insane, they kept it to themselves, because questioning the system was not, shall we say, encouraged. Now we need to talk about something that makes the black broth and iron currency look quaint by comparison. We need to discuss what happened when Spartan boys finished their basic education and were deemed ready for the final test before full citizenship. Because if you thought the agoge was harsh, and it was, make no mistake, the culmination of that training system involved something that modern people would recognize as state-sponsored terrorism. The Spartans called it the krypteia, which translates roughly to secret service or hidden things, and it was exactly as ominous as that name suggests. Let's set the scene properly, because context matters when we're discussing institutionalized violence. By the time a Spartan youth reached 18 or 19 years old, he'd already been through more than a decade of military training. He'd been taken from his mother at 7, inducted into the agoge, subjected to deliberate food deprivation to teach him to steal successfully, beaten if caught stealing, forced to fight other boys, trained in weapons, taught to endure pain, and generally processed through a system designed to strip away anything resembling childhood innocence. He was already, by any reasonable standard, a capable warrior and a thoroughly indoctrinated member of Spartan society. But apparently that wasn't enough. The Spartans, in their infinite wisdom about what constitutes healthy child development, decided that one more test was necessary. And this test wasn't about physical endurance or military skill or even the ability to eat terrible food without complaint. This test was about whether a young man could kill another human being in cold blood, with premeditation as a matter of policy, not in the heat of battle, where adrenaline and survival instinct take over, not in self-defense, but deliberately, methodically, as an act of social control. Here's how the cryptia worked, as best we can reconstruct from ancient sources that are, understandably, somewhat cagey about the details. The most promising young men, the ones who had shown exceptional ability, leadership potential, and thorough absorption of Spartan values, were selected for this special duty. Not everyone participated. It was considered an honor, which tells you everything you need to know about Spartan values right there. These selected youths would be sent out into the countryside with minimal equipment: a knife, a cloak, and presumably the complete absence of moral qualms that their education had instilled in them. Their mission was straightforward in concept, horrifying in practice. They were to hunt helots. Specifically, they were to identify and eliminate the strongest, most capable, most potentially troublesome helots they could find. These weren't helots who had committed crimes or fomented rebellion. These were people whose only offense was being strong, intelligent, or possessed of leadership qualities, traits that in any other society would be admirable, but in Sparta's system represented existential threats to the social order. The young men would travel through the helot territories, mostly at night to avoid detection, observing the enslaved population. They'd look for men who seemed respected by others, who showed signs of confidence or capability, who might someday organize resistance, and then they'd kill them, quietly, efficiently, leaving no trace. It was assassination as agricultural management, treating human beings as weeds to be periodically culled before they could take root and spread. Now, before we go further, we need to understand the legal framework that made this possible, because even the Spartans needed some fig leaf of legitimacy for this program. Every year, when the Ephors took office, one of their first official acts was to formally declare war on the helots, not because the helots had done anything specifically threatening that year, not because there was an active rebellion, but as a blanket declaration that created a legal loophole. If you're at war with someone, killing them isn't murder, it's combat. Therefore, any helot killed by a cryptia member wasn't being murdered. He was a casualty of this permanent one-sided war. It's the kind of legal reasoning that would make a totalitarian bureaucrat proud. You've got a class of people you need to terrorize to maintain control, but you also have religious and social prohibitions against murder within your community. Solution: declare permanent war on them so that killing them doesn't count as murder. Problem solved, conscience theoretically clear, terror campaign legally sanctioned. The Spartans were nothing if not thorough in their systematic oppression. The practical effect of the crypteia was multifaceted and deeply sinister. On the most obvious level, it eliminated potential leaders before they could lead. If you killed every helot who showed signs of capability or courage, you prevented the emergence of organized resistance. It's decapitation as preventive measure, removing heads before they could wear crowns of rebellion. This wasn't reactive violence responding to actual threats. It was proactive violence based on the assumption that any capable helot was inherently a threat simply by existing. But the crypteia served other purposes beyond just eliminating potential troublemakers. It maintained a climate of constant fear among the helot population. Imagine living in a society where the strongest and best among you regularly disappeared in the night, where showing too much competence or leadership could get you killed, where you never knew when some Spartan teenager was watching from the shadows. With a knife, you'd learn pretty quickly to keep your head down, to not stand out, to cultivate mediocrity as survival strategy. The crypteia created a culture of fear that was probably more effective at preventing rebellion than the actual killings themselves. And then there's what it did to the young Spartans themselves, which is where this practice reveals its true genius, or true horror, depending on your perspective. These weren't hardened adult warriors being sent out to do dirty work. These were teenagers, 18 or 19 years old, being deliberately transformed into killers. The crypteia was a rite of passage, an initiation that turned boys into men by forcing them to cross a moral line that most societies teach their children never to cross. Think about the psychological impact of spending a year hunting human beings. Not metaphorically hunting, not competing against them in games or sports, but actually stalking and killing them. You'd learn to see helots not as people, but as targets, as problems to be solved, as threats to be eliminated. You'd develop the mentality of an apex predator, viewing an entire class of human beings as prey. and crucially, you'd prove to yourself and your society that you were capable of the violence necessary to maintain Sparta's system. Because that's what the Crypteia was really about, making sure that each generation of Spartans had members who had personally participated in the oppression of the Helots, who had blood on their hands, who couldn't later claim ignorance or distance themselves from the system. Once you've spent a year killing Helots in the dark, you're invested in maintaining the system that required those killings. You've got skin in the game, quite literally. The Crypteia bound young Spartans to the social order through the most intimate form of complicity possible. The selection process for the Crypteia is worth examining because it reveals what Sparta valued in its future leaders. These weren't the strongest or fastest or most skilled fighters, though they were certainly capable in those areas. These were the young men who had shown the strongest commitment to Spartan values, who had proven themselves most thoroughly indoctrinated, who could be trusted to carry out this mission without moral hesitation or rebellion. In other words, the Crypteia selected for sociopathy, or at least for the ability to suppress empathy in service of state ideology. That's who Sparta wanted in leadership positions, men who had proven they could kill on command without question. The actual tactics used in the Crypteia varied, but certain patterns emerge from the historical accounts. The young men would typically operate alone or in very small groups, maximizing stealth and deniability. They'd observe Helot communities during the day from hidden positions, identifying targets. Then at night they'd strike, usually attacking lone individuals away from witnesses, killing quickly and quietly, disappearing before anyone could respond. It was guerrilla warfare against an unarmed civilian population, and it was devastatingly effective at its intended purpose. There's a particular cruelty in the timing and methodology. These attacks happened at night, when people should feel safest in their homes or communities. They targeted the best people, the natural leaders, the strong, the capable, rather than the weak or criminal. They were unpredictable and seemingly random, striking without warning or pattern that might allow defensive preparation. This is psychological warfare refined to a science. Maximize fear, minimize actual resistance, ensure the subject population remains fragmented and demoralized. The Crypteia also served as advanced military training in ways that the regular agog could not. Fighting in formation, which was the core of Greek warfare, required discipline and coordination, but not necessarily individual initiative or stealth. The Crypteia taught skills that would later prove valuable in special operations: reconnaissance, infiltration, silent killing, operating independently behind enemy lines. Some historians have suggested that Crypteia veterans formed the core of Sparta's intelligence and special operations capabilities. They'd learned to operate in hostile territory with minimal support, to gather information without being detected, to strike decisively when opportunity presented itself. These are valuable military skills, learned through what we might generously call practical exercises, and more honestly call state terrorism. Now, we should acknowledge that our sources for the Crypteia are somewhat limited and potentially biased. Most of what we know comes from later writers, particularly Plutarch, who was writing centuries after classical Sparta's peak, and may have been influenced by Sparta's reputation for exotic brutality. Some modern historians have questioned whether the Crypteia was really as widespread or as lethal as described, suggesting it might have been more about surveillance and intimidation than wholesale killing. Maybe the young men were mostly observing Helot communities, gathering intelligence, only occasionally killing particularly dangerous individuals. But honestly, even if we accept the most charitable interpretation, that the Crypteia was primarily surveillance with only occasional murder, that's still pretty damning. You're still sending teenagers out to spy on enslaved people, with the explicit authority and expectation to kill them if deemed necessary. You're still creating a system where young men learn to view an entire class of people as existential threats requiring constant monitoring and periodic violent suppression. The question isn't whether the Crypteia was bad, it definitely was, but rather how bad it was on a scale from morally questionable to cartoonishly evil. The psychological preparation for the Crypteia presumably began long before the actual year of service. The Agog would have gradually conditioned young Spartans to see Helots as less than human, as dangerous animals that needed to be controlled, as the enemy within. There would have been stories shared among the boys about Helot uprisings, real or exaggerated to instill appropriate fear and hatred. The annual war declaration sent a clear message: these people are not part of our moral community, they are permanent enemies, Violence against them is not only acceptable, but necessary and honourable. One particularly disturbing aspect of the crypteia is how it inverted normal moral development. In most societies, coming of age involves learning to take responsibility, to care for others, to become a productive member of the community. The Spartan version of coming of age involved learning to kill efficiently, to suppress empathy, to prioritize abstract state security over concrete human life. It's like if modern society decided that the path to adulthood ran through successful participation in a purge. Not exactly the kind of initiation rite that builds healthy, emotionally balanced adults. The Helots, for their part, understood exactly what was happening. They knew about the crypteia. They knew that their strongest young men were particularly vulnerable. They knew that the Spartans sent their warriors in training to hunt them as practice. This knowledge must have been absolutely corrosive to any sense of community or hope. How do you build resistance when you know that anyone who might lead it will be targeted for elimination? How do you maintain morale when the system is specifically designed to kill anyone who shows too much strength or courage? The crypteia was brilliant in its cruelty. It turned the Helots' own virtues against them, making capability a liability and strength a death sentence. There's an interesting parallel here to other historical systems of oppression. The Spartans had essentially invented what we might call leadership targeting, or tall poppy syndrome, as deliberate policy. They recognized that resistance requires leadership, and they systematically eliminated potential leaders before they could emerge. This is the same logic that authoritarian regimes throughout history have used. Identify and neutralize threats before they can organize. The Spartans just did it with unusual efficiency and made it a formative experience for their elite youth. The religious and philosophical justifications for the crypteia are largely absent from our sources, which is interesting in itself. The Spartans apparently didn't feel the need to develop elaborate theological or ethical frameworks to justify this practice. It was simply necessary, therefore it was done. This reflects a pragmatic, almost sociopathic approach to morality that characterized much of Spartan society. Right and wrong weren't determined by abstract principles or divine law, they were determined by what served the state's interests. The crypteia served the state's interests, ergo it was right. Case closed, no further discussion needed. We should also consider what the crypteia tells us about Sparta's fundamental insecurity. A truly confident, stable society doesn't need to send teenagers out to murder enslaved people in the night. The very existence of the crypteia reveals Sparta's desperate fear of the Helot population they depended on. They'd built their entire civilization on the backs of a massive enslaved labour force that outnumbered them 7 or 8 to 1. Every Spartiate knew that if the Helots ever successfully organised and rebelled, Sparta would fall. The crypteia was a pressure release valve, a way of managing that constant grinding terror through proactive violence. The long-term psychological effects on crypteia participants are difficult to assess from our limited sources, but we can make educated guesses. Some undoubtedly became desensitized to violence in ways that served them well as soldiers but poorly as human beings. Others might have developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD or moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from committing acts your conscience knows are wrong, even if your training says they're necessary. Still others probably convinced themselves completely that they'd done the right thing, that Helots were genuinely dangerous and elimination of potential leaders was justified self-defense. The human mind is remarkably good at rationalizing violence when it's presented as necessary and honorable. There's also the question of how crypteia service affected social status within Sparta. Did participants form a kind of elite brotherhood, bound by shared experience of this dark rite? Did they speak openly about what they'd done, or was it something that remained unspoken, a shared secret that created bonds without need for discussion? Did successful crypteia service mark someone as a future leader, or was it simply one more test in an endless series of tests that defined Spartan manhood? Our sources don't give clear answers, but the institutional permanence of the practice suggests it was well integrated into Spartan society rather than being a shameful secret. The crypteia continued for centuries, which tells us something important. It worked, at least by Sparta's standards. The Helots never successfully rebelled and overthrew their masters, despite overwhelming numerical superiority. They remained cowed, fragmented, unable or unwilling to organize effective resistance. Whether this was primarily due to the crypteia or to the many other mechanisms of control Sparta employed, constant surveillance, annual war declarations, prohibitions on assembly, psychological conditioning, is debatable. But the Spartans clearly believed the crypteia was effective, or they wouldn't have maintained it for so long. Comparing the crypteia to other ancient practices of military initiation is illuminating. Many warrior cultures had rites of passage involving violence, fighting wild animals, participating in raids against enemies, enduring pain or hardship. But few, if any, institutionalized the cold-blooded murder of their own subject population as a coming-of-age ritual. The Romans didn't send their youth to hunt Germanic slaves. The Athenians didn't have their ephebes practice on metics. The crypteia stands out even in the context of ancient world brutality, which was considerable. It's one thing to ask young warriors to prove themselves in combat against armed enemies. It's quite another to send them to assassinate unarmed civilians as a test of their commitment to the social order. The moral implications of the crypteia extend beyond just the practice itself. It reveals something fundamental about what kind of society Sparta had become. They'd created a system where the most promising young men, the future leaders, were selected specifically for their willingness and ability to commit premeditated murder against unarmed people. They'd institutionalized terror and assassination as normal components of civic life. They'd made complicity in oppression a requirement for citizenship and leadership. This isn't just morally questionable, it's a society that had thoroughly corrupted its own values in service of maintaining power. And here's the thing that should really make us pause. The Spartans were praised for this. Not universally, certainly. Many other Greeks found them brutal and strange. But there was also genuine admiration for Spartan discipline, Spartan toughness, Spartan military effectiveness. The crypteia was part of that package. You can't separate Sparta's military success from the brutal system that produced it. The warriors who fought so effectively in formation had been psychologically conditioned through years of harsh training that culminated in hunting human beings in the dark. The discipline that made the Spartan phalanx so formidable was built on practices that we would now classify as crimes against humanity. This creates an uncomfortable question. Can we admire Spartan military excellence while condemning the system that produced it? Can we appreciate the discipline, the courage, the effectiveness, while acknowledging that these qualities were developed through what amounts to institutional child abuse and state terrorism? Or are these things inextricable? The excellence and the brutality two sides of the same coin, impossible to separate without fundamentally misunderstanding what Sparta actually was. The crypteia also raises questions about the nature of military training and the production of effective soldiers more broadly. Throughout history, armies have grappled with the problem of turning civilians into people capable of killing on command. Modern military training uses various techniques: dehumanizing language about enemies, intensive conditioning, small unit bonding, appeals to honor and duty. The Spartans just cut through all the subtlety and had their trainees literally practice on real human beings. It's honest in a horrifying way. We need people who can kill without hesitation, so we'll have them kill without hesitation during training. No simulation, no gradual escalation, just straight to the reality of taking human life. From the Helots' perspective, the crypteia must have been a constant presence, a shadow over daily existence. Even if they personally never encountered a crypteia member, they knew the system existed. They knew that strong young men sometimes disappeared. They knew that showing too much capability or leadership could be fatal. This knowledge would shape behavior in profound ways, encouraging passivity, discouraging excellence, fostering a culture of keeping your head down and surviving rather than thriving. It's social engineering through terror, and it was devastatingly effective. The annual nature of the crypteia, with new participants each year, meant that this wasn't just a one-time historical practice, but an ongoing institution, constantly renewed, constantly producing new participants who had crossed that moral line. Over generations, this would create a substantial portion of Sparta's citizen population who had participated in the crypteia. It wasn't some dark secret known only to a few. It was widely distributed knowledge and experience throughout the upper echelons of Spartan society. Everyone knew about it, many had done it, and the system perpetuated itself through each new generation. There's something particularly bleak about the fact that the crypteia wasn't presented as a necessary evil or a shameful secret, but as an honor. It was prestigious to be selected. It was a mark of distinction. This suggests a society that had so thoroughly normalized violence against subjugated populations that they saw nothing wrong with making it a celebrated coming-of-age ritual. The cognitive framework had shifted so far that what should have been shameful was instead honourable, what should have been hidden was instead acknowledged, what should have been questioned was instead celebrated. The practical logistics of the crypteia raise interesting questions we can't fully answer. How did participants sustain themselves during their year of service? Did they steal from helot communities, further terrorizing their targets? Did they have some system of supply from Sparta? How did they avoid detection not just from helots, but from perioikoi or foreign visitors who might stumble upon their activities? How coordinated were they? Did multiple participants operate in the same areas, or were they dispersed to cover maximum territory? These operational details are lost to us, but they would have been crucial to the program's success. The relationship between the crypteia and the regular military system is also worth considering. Once a young man completed his crypteia service and returned to normal citizenship, how did that experience translate to conventional warfare? Presumably the skills of stealth, observation, and decisive action in isolation would be valuable. But there's also a potential downside. If you've been operating independently for a year, does it make it harder to reintegrate into a system that prioritizes formation fighting and collective action? Did some crypteia veterans struggle to transition from lone wolf operations to phalanx discipline? We should also think about the mothers in all this, which brings us full circle to where this education system began. Remember that mother at dawn, handing over her 7-year-old son to the Agoj? 12 years later, that boy has spent a year hunting and killing human beings. He's been transformed from child to weapon, and she hasn't been part of that transformation. She's had to accept that her son now inhabits a moral universe where certain lives don't count, where killing can be honourable and necessary, where empathy is weakness. What does that do to the parent-child relationship? What does it do to a mother's understanding of what her child has become? The crypteia stands as perhaps the darkest example of what Sparta was willing to do to maintain its peculiar social order. It wasn't enough to have harsh military training. It wasn't enough to create economic structures that prevented change. It wasn't enough to maintain constant surveillance and annual war declarations. They also needed to ensure that each generation's most promising young men had personally participated in the violence that upheld the system, had proven themselves capable of the cruelty necessary to keep the helots subjugated, had demonstrated that they valued the state over basic human morality. And it worked. For centuries it worked. The helots remained suppressed. The Spartan system endured. The young men who went through the crypteia became the warriors and leaders who maintained Sparta's military dominance. From a purely utilitarian, amoral perspective, the crypteia was effective. It achieved its goals. The question we're left with is whether those goals were worth achieving, whether the cost in human terms, both for the helots who were hunted and the young Spartans who became hunters, was justified by the creation and maintenance of Sparta's military. Excellence. The modern reader looks at the crypteia and sees a horrifying practice, state-sponsored assassination, institutionalized violence against civilians, and we're right to see it that way. But we should also recognize that the Spartans themselves saw it differently. For them, it was necessary, honorable, a crucial component of their survival as a society. They weren't monsters. They were people who had constructed a moral framework that justified monstrous acts. That framework was built on fear, on militarism, on the conviction that their way of life was worth any cost. And for a long time they maintained that conviction despite all evidence that the cost was far too high. The sun rose over the Eurotas valley, and somewhere in the hills, a young Spartiate watched a helot settlement from concealment. He'd been there for days, observing, learning routines, identifying targets. Tonight, or perhaps the next night, he would strike. He would take a life to prove his worthiness for citizenship. And the next morning he would wake in his hiding place, one day closer to the end of his service, one step further along the path from boy to warrior, one more act of violence separating him from whoever he might have been in a different society. The system ground forward, producing warriors at the cost of humanity, maintaining order through terror, surviving through the systematic elimination of anything that might threaten its rigid structure. And everyone called it necessary, called it honourable, called it Spartan. After that particularly dark detour into the crypteia, we need to shift our focus to another aspect of Spartan society that was, if not exactly cheerful, at least less overtly homicidal. Let's talk about Spartan women, who occupied one of the most paradoxical positions in the ancient Greek world. They were simultaneously more free and more constrained than their counterparts in other cities, more visible and more instrumentalized, more educated and more reduced to biological function. If that sounds contradictory, well, welcome to Sparta, where contradictions are a lifestyle choice. To understand how weird the Spartan approach to women was, we need to first establish what normal looked like for Greek women in the classical period. In Athens, which serves as our comparison point for most discussions of Greek culture, respectable citizen women lived lives of remarkable seclusion. They spent most of their time in the women's quarters of the house, rarely appeared in public, received minimal formal education, and were expected to be seen as little as possible and heard even less. The Athenian ideal woman was modest, quiet, industrious at the loom, and essentially invisible outside her household. When Athenian men praised women in public, it was often with the line, "She about whom the least is said among men, whether in praise or blame, is best." In other words, the best woman is the one nobody talks about because nobody knows she exists. Sparta looked at this model and said, that seems unnecessarily complicated and also probably bad for producing healthy babies, because everything in Sparta eventually came back to producing healthy babies who would grow up to be warriors, which meant that the vessels for those babies, Spartan women, needed to be physically strong. This was not some enlightened proto-feminist insight about women's capabilities. This was pure pragmatism with the emotional warmth of a cost-benefit analysis. Strong mothers produce strong sons. Strong sons become effective warriors. Effective warriors keep the helots suppressed and foreign enemies at bay. Therefore, women must be strong. QED, as the mathematicians would say, though I doubt many Spartan women felt particularly empowered by being valued primarily as optimized baby-making machines. This utilitarian approach to women's bodies led to practices that shocked other Greeks, and let me tell you, it took a lot to shock ancient Greeks. Spartan girls exercised publicly. Not just exercised, but exercised in ways that left them partially clothed or, according to some accounts, completely naked. They ran, they wrestled, they threw javelins and discuses, they competed in athletic contests just like boys did. Other Greek city-states, where respectable women were expected to stay covered and indoors, found this absolutely scandalous. There are accounts of visitors to Sparta being confronted with the sight of young women running races or wrestling in the gymnasium, their bodies on full display, and being thoroughly scandalized by the whole situation. The Spartans' justification for this was characteristically blunt. Modesty doesn't win wars, physical strength does, and physical strength requires training. If you want women to bear healthy children, you need those women to be athletes, not pale shut-ins who've spent their lives sitting at looms. The logic was sound, even if the execution was probably uncomfortable for the participants. Because let's be clear, exercising naked in public view wasn't empowering in any modern sense. It wasn't about women claiming ownership of their bodies or rejecting patriarchal beauty standards. It was about making sure the state's investment in female bodies was being properly maintained. Your body wasn't yours. It belonged to Sparta, and Sparta required it to be in peak physical condition. The athletic training for girls began young, much like the agog for boys, though girls weren't taken from their mothers at 7 and didn't live in barracks. That's an important distinction, actually. Spartan girls grew up in their family homes, maintained relationships with their mothers, had a recognizable childhood in ways that boys did not. But they still trained. They still competed. They still learned that their physical capabilities were being cultivated for a specific state purpose. The competitions themselves were public events where young women would demonstrate their athletic prowess in front of audiences that included men, which was basically unthinkable in places like Athens. There are descriptions of choral performances where groups of young women would sing and dance, again with minimal clothing in front of mixed audiences. The Spartans saw this as normal and beneficial. It allowed young men to evaluate potential wives based on visible physical fitness, and it encouraged healthy competition among the women themselves. Other Greeks saw it as evidence that Sparta was basically a city of exhibitionists with questionable morals. Now, the question of how much clothing Spartan women actually wore during these exercises is debated among historians. Some ancient sources say they were completely naked, like male athletes. Others say they wore short tunics that left the legs exposed, which was scandalous enough by Greek standards where respectable women wore long robes that covered everything. The truth probably varied by context and time period, but the point is that Spartan women were visibly, publicly athletic in ways that were unthinkable for women elsewhere in Greece. They had muscles. They moved through public space with confidence. They occupied athletic venues that were usually all male spaces. This was revolutionary, right up until you remember that the entire purpose was to make them better breeding stock for the state. But here's where things get interesting. Spartan women weren't just physically trained. They also received education in literacy, music, and dance. This was genuinely unusual for the ancient world, where female literacy was rare outside of certain elite circles. Most Greek women couldn't read or write. Many couldn't even do basic arithmetic beyond household accounting. Spartan women could do all of that and more. They learned poetry, they learned music, they learned choreographed group performances. They were, by the standards of their time, educated women. Again, though, we need to interrogate the motives. This wasn't education for education's sake. This wasn't about enriching women's minds or giving them tools for intellectual independence. Educated women could better manage households when their husbands were living in barracks or away at war. Literate women could teach their children before the boys entered the agog. Musical training contributed to religious festivals and civic ceremonies. Everything served a purpose. The Spartans didn't do things because they were nice or progressive. They did things because those things contributed to military effectiveness. The musical and dance training had another function. It was part of how Spartan society reinforced gender roles and civic values. The choral performances weren't just entertainment. They were educational tools, teaching proper Spartan values through song and movement. Young women would perform pieces that praised warrior virtues, mocked cowardice, celebrated childbearing, and reinforced the ideology that defined Sparta. They were active participants in their own indoctrination, learning to value exactly what the state wanted them to value, while believing these were their own authentic preferences. One of the most famous aspects of Spartan women's role was their participation in a particular kind of social control, mocking. Spartan women were not only allowed but encouraged to publicly mock men who showed cowardice or failed to live up to military standards. This wasn't whispered criticism or private judgment. This was open, public shaming, often delivered through song or direct confrontation. A Spartan woman could stand in public and mock a man for running away in battle, and this was considered not only acceptable but admirable. She was enforcing social norms, maintaining the military culture, doing her part to ensure men remained brave. The most famous example of this is probably apocryphal but too good not to mention. The phrase, "come back with your shield or on it," was supposedly what Spartan mothers told their sons as they went off to war. The shield was heavy and unwieldy. If you were running away in retreat, you'd drop it to move faster. So coming back with your shield meant you fought honourably. Coming back on your shield meant you died in combat and were carried back on it. The one thing you couldn't do was come back without your shield, because that meant you ran away. The message was clear. I'd rather you die than be a coward. Love you, son, but also don't embarrass the family by surviving through cowardice. Now, whether actual mothers said this to actual sons is debatable. It might have been more of a cultural saying than a real practice. But the fact that it was attributed to Spartan women tells us something important. Women were expected to be enforcers of military values, to prioritize state needs over maternal instincts, to value bravery more than life. A woman who mourned her son's death too openly might be criticized for weakness. A woman who welcomed back a son who had shown cowardice might be criticized for enabling that cowardice. The proper Spartan mother raised warriors and accepted that warriors die, and she was supposed to do this without excessive emotional display. This brings us to one of the central paradoxes. Spartan women were valued for their strength, but only specific kinds of strength. Physical strength was good because it produced healthy babies. Moral strength was good when it meant enforcing military values. But any strength that challenged the fundamental structure of society, any desire for political power, any questioning of women's role as producers of warriors, any suggestion that women might want something other than what the state needed them to want, that kind of strength was not acceptable. Women were free to be strong within carefully defined boundaries, and those boundaries all pointed towards supporting the military state. The marriage system reflected this same paradoxical mix of freedom and constraint. Spartan women married later than women in other Greek cities, typically in their late teens rather than early teens. This was again pragmatic. Older mothers are more likely to survive childbirth, and you don't want your valuable baby production infrastructure dying in labour before she's had time to produce multiple warriors. So girls didn't marry until they were physically mature enough to safely bear children. not because anyone cared about the girls' welfare as individuals, but because premature pregnancy was inefficient. The marriage itself was bizarre by Greek standards. There was apparently a ritual where the bride's hair was cut short and she was dressed in men's clothing and left in a dark room. The groom would then visit her secretly, have sex with her, and leave. He'd continue living in the barracks with his age group, only visiting his wife occasionally and secretly at night. This went on for years, sometimes until the couple had already had children. It's like the world's worst long-distance relationship, except the distance is measured in city blocks rather than miles, and the relationship is happening in your own city, but you still can't live together because military discipline requires men to live in barracks until they're 30. Various explanations have been proposed for this strange arrangement. Some historians think it was about maintaining the men's focus on military training rather than domestic life. Others suggest it was a way of making sex more exciting through scarcity and secrecy. Still others think it was about not breaking men's primary bonds with their military cohort too abruptly. Whatever the reason, it meant that Spartan women spent the early years of their marriages living essentially as single heads of household, managing property, and making decisions without direct male supervision. This gave them practical experience and authority that women in other Greek cities rarely had. And here's where Spartan women gained real, tangible power: property ownership. Spartan women could inherit property. They could own land. They could control wealth in ways that were impossible for women in most of the ancient world. By the Hellenistic period, Spartan women reportedly controlled a significant portion, possibly as much as 2/5, of Sparta's land. This wasn't because Sparta was feminist. This was because Sparta's inheritance system allowed property to pass through female lines, and because so many men died in warfare, leaving estates to daughters and widows. The combination of absent husbands and property ownership meant that Spartan women had real economic power. They managed estates, directed the helots who worked the land, made agricultural and financial decisions. They weren't politically enfranchised. They couldn't vote or hold office, but they had influence through wealth and through their role as mothers and wives of citizens. Some ancient sources complain that Spartan women were too powerful, too outspoken, too influential in politics they technically couldn't participate in. Whether these complaints were accurate or just sexist griping from men uncomfortable with women having any power at all is hard to determine. The education and physical training, the delayed marriage, the property ownership, the public presence, all of these things meant that Spartan women were more visible, more active, more economically powerful than their counterparts in other Greek cities. And yet, for all of this apparent freedom, their fundamental purpose remained fixed and narrow: produce healthy male children who will become warriors. Every freedom they enjoyed was justified by how it served that purpose. They were strong so they could bear strong sons. They were educated so they could raise intelligent sons. They owned property so they could support households while husbands were at war or living in barracks. They were visible in public so potential fathers could evaluate their fitness for producing those all-important sons. The psychological impact of this utilitarian framework must have been considerable. You're told you're valued, but only for your reproductive capacity. You're educated, but only enough to serve state purposes. You're free to move in public space, but only in specific controlled ways. You have economic power, but no political rights. You can mock men for cowardice, but you can't vote on whether to go to war. It's like being given autonomy in every area except the ones that actually matter for determining the direction of society. There's also the question of women's emotional lives, about which our sources are largely silent. What did it feel like to hand your 7-year-old son over to the agoj, knowing you'd never have that maternal relationship again? What did it feel like to tell your son to come back with his shield or on it, knowing that you were essentially saying death was preferable to dishonor? What did it feel like to manage an estate while your husband lived in barracks a few streets away because military discipline was more important than married life? Our sources don't tell us because ancient male historians weren't particularly interested in women's emotional experiences. We can infer that it probably wasn't great, but we can't know for certain. The famous Spartan women whose names have come down to us were typically famous for saying things that reinforced military values. Gorgo, the daughter of King Cleomenes and wife of King Leonidas, has several attributed sayings, most of which are basically Spartan women are tough and breed warriors. There's a story where a woman from Attica asks her, "Why are you Spartan women the only ones who can rule over men?" Gorgo supposedly replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men," which is either a sick burn or a sad statement about how women's value was entirely tied to their sons, depending on your perspective. The thing about all these famous sayings and stories is that they were recorded by men, often men from other cities, and they were recorded to make points about Sparta being unusual, being tough, being dedicated to military values above all else. We're not hearing directly from Spartan women about their own experiences. We're hearing stories about Spartan women filtered through male authors who were either admiring Sparta's military culture or condemning its perceived looseness around women's behaviour. Neither perspective gives us direct access to what Spartan women actually thought and felt about their lives. What we can say with certainty is that Spartan women occupied a unique position in the Greek world. They were more physically active, more educated, more economically powerful, and more publicly visible than women in other cities. They also lived in a society that had instrumentalized them to an unusual degree, where every aspect of their greater freedom was justified by reference to producing better warriors. It's like if someone said, "We're going to give you extensive education and athletic training and economic power, but only because it makes you a more effective tool for our military state." That's both more and less than what we'd call liberation. The contrast with Athenian women is particularly stark and illuminating. Athenian women were sequestered, poorly educated and economically dependent. But Athens also produced a flourishing culture of philosophy, drama, art, and political discourse. Sparta's women were stronger, more visible, more educated. But Sparta produced almost no art, no philosophy, no literature. The question becomes, which society was actually better for women? The one that kept them hidden, but allowed some intellectual and cultural flourishing that occasionally benefited them indirectly? Or the one that made them physically stronger and gave them property rights, but instrumentalized them completely in service of militarism? It's not clear there's a good answer to that question. There's also something deeply ironic about Sparta's approach to gender. They claimed to value equality among citizens. All Spartiates were theoretically equal. But this equality was built on the backs of helots who outnumbered them and had no rights at all. Similarly, they gave women certain freedoms and powers, but those freedoms existed within a framework that completely defined women's value by their biological function. It's equality and freedom, but only in the narrowest possible sense, only within boundaries that don't threaten the fundamental power structures. The religious life of Spartan women provides another window into their position. Women participated actively in religious festivals, which were major events in Spartan public life. They performed choral dances, they made offerings, they participated in processions. Some of these festivals were women-only affairs, spaces where women could gather without male supervision. Others were public events where women performed in front of the entire community. Religion gave women a legitimate space for public presence and collective action, though again, it was all carefully channeled into supporting the state and its values. One particularly interesting festival was the Hyacinthia, which honoured Apollo and the mythical youth Hyacinthos. This 3-day festival included performances by choruses of young women, sacrifices, feasting, and athletic competitions. It was one of the most important events in the Spartan calendar, and women were central participants. But even here, in religious celebration, the themes revolved around youth, beauty, physical excellence, all things that ultimately connected back to producing strong offspring and maintaining military culture. The question of Spartan women's sexuality is tricky territory, because our sources are limited and potentially biased. Some ancient writers claim that Spartan women were promiscuous, that the system of men living away from home led to infidelity. Other writers said that Spartans practiced wife-sharing, where an older man might allow a younger man to have children with his wife to produce more offspring. Whether any of this was true, or whether it was propaganda from outsiders who disapproved of Spartan gender arrangements, is hard to determine. What we can say is that Spartan attitudes toward marriage and reproduction were more flexible and pragmatic than in other Greek cities, prioritizing the production of children over strict sexual propriety. There's a story, again, possibly apocryphal, about a man asking a Spartan why they didn't protect their women's chastity more carefully. The Spartan supposedly replied that they didn't need to because Spartan women were too strong and too committed to Spartan values to dishonor themselves. Whether this was true or just propaganda, it reflects the Spartan view that women's virtue came from internal strength and commitment to the state, rather than from external controls and sequestration. It's a different model of female honour, one based on agency rather than seclusion, though agency that's been thoroughly conditioned to serve state purposes. The aging process for Spartan women must have been psychologically complex. Your value was tied to your ability to produce children. What happened when that ability ended? Did older women maintain influence through their sons and grandsons? Did their property ownership give them continued importance? Or were they somewhat sidelined, their primary function fulfilled, relegated to mentoring younger women in how to be proper Spartan mothers? We don't have clear answers, but it's worth considering that in a society that valued women primarily for reproduction, menopause might have represented not just a biological transition but a social one. The contrast between Spartan women's physical freedom and their functional constraint creates a sort of optical illusion. From certain angles, Sparta looks progressive, women exercising publicly, owning property, speaking their minds. From other angles, it looks like a particularly effective form of oppression that convinced women to enthusiastically support a system that reduced them to breeding stock. Both perspectives contain truth. Spartan women had genuine powers and freedoms that women elsewhere lacked. They also lived in a society that had thoroughly instrumentalized them and convinced them that their instrumental value was actually empowerment. It's worth noting that this system worked, in the sense that it achieved its goals. Spartan women did produce warriors, they did manage estates effectively, they did enforce military values through social pressure. They were, by the state standards, successful in their roles. Whether they were happy in those roles, whether they ever wished for different options, whether they chafed against the limitations or embraced them fully, these questions our sources don't answer because nobody thought to ask. What we're left with is a portrait of women who are stronger, louder, more visible, and more powerful than women in most ancient societies, but who were also completely defined by their relationship to the military state. They were running muses, yes, running literal races, running households, running circles around the limited expectations of Greek womanhood. But they were running in lanes carefully marked out by state ideology, and straying from those lanes wasn't an option. They were freer than Athenian women in their seclusion, more constrained than Athenian women who could at least imagine that their limited sphere was somehow private and their own. The sun set over the training grounds where young women finished their athletic competitions, muscles tired, bodies strong, ready to serve their function in the great machine that was Sparta. They had freedom of movement, freedom to be physically powerful, freedom to own property and speak their minds. They also had one primary purpose, one essential function, one way to measure success: bear strong sons, raise them until 7, hand them over to the state, and tell them to come back with their shields. It was liberation, but only in the spaces that didn't matter. It was power, but only of the kind that reinforced their powerlessness in the larger structure. It was freedom, but freedom that existed entirely in service to the very system that constrained them. And if that seems contradictory, well, that's Sparta for you, building paradoxes into every aspect of society and calling them principles. Now that we've covered the paradoxical position of Spartan women, we need to talk about what happened when the men got together for dinner. Because in Sparta, dinner wasn't just dinner, it was surveillance operation disguised as social bonding, performance review disguised as fellowship, and citizenship test disguised as a meal. Welcome to the Syssitia, the communal dining system that turned every evening into an exercise in collective conformity with a side of black broth. The basic structure was deceptively simple. Every Spartiate citizen from age 20 to age 60 was required to belong to a Syssition, a dining group of roughly 15 men. These weren't casual dinner clubs you could skip when you weren't feeling social. These weren't optional networking events. Attendance was mandatory, daily, for 40 years of your life. Miss too many dinners without extremely good reason, and you'd face social censure. Fail to contribute your required share of food, and you'd lose your citizenship entirely. It's like if your job required you to have lunch with the same 14 co-workers every single day for 4 decades, and missing lunch too often got you fired from being a citizen. Not exactly a relaxing dining experience. Each member of the Syssition was required to contribute a specific amount of food each month. The standard contribution was barley meal, wine, cheese, figs, and a small amount of money to buy meat or fish. These amounts were fixed. Everyone contributed the same, regardless of how wealthy their landholdings were or how productive their helots happened to be. The contributions went into a common pool, and meals were prepared and served communally. It was enforced economic equality at the dinner table, which sounds almost charming until you remember that failing to make your contribution meant you'd be kicked out of the citizen class and lose all political rights. Think about the implications of this for a moment. You're a spartiate whose land has had a bad year. Maybe the harvest was poor, maybe your helots got sick or ran away, maybe you just made poor agricultural decisions. Through no moral failing, just through bad luck or bad management, you can't make your monthly food contribution. What happens? You get demoted. You become a hypomaion, one of the inferiors, a person who used to be a citizen but no longer counts. You lose your vote, your place in the assembly, your position in the military, your social standing, because you couldn't bring enough barley to dinner. This created an incredibly powerful mechanism for maintaining social conformity and preventing both poverty and excessive wealth within the citizen class. If you were struggling economically, it became everyone's problem immediately because you couldn't make your contributions. Your secession brothers would know instantly that something was wrong. There was no hiding economic distress, no suffering in private, no keeping up appearances. Your financial situation was literally on the table every month. This could be supportive. If you were temporarily struggling, your group might help you out, cover your contribution, give you time to recover. Or it could be brutal. If you were chronically unable to contribute, you'd be out, your citizenship revoked, your status destroyed. The flip side was equally powerful. If you were becoming too wealthy, if your lands were producing significantly more than required, the Syssitia system prevented you from converting that wealth into social status through lavish displays. You still ate the same black broth as everyone else. You still sat at the same rough tables. You still contributed the same fixed amount. Your extra wealth couldn't buy you a better dining experience, couldn't purchase luxury at the table, couldn't be used to host rival dinners that might create competing power centers. The Syssitia enforced equality by making it impossible to use wealth to create social distance. Now let's talk about what these dinners actually looked like, because communal dining conjures images of friendly fellowship and warm camaraderie, and we need to adjust those expectations significantly. The dining halls were basic structures. We've already discussed Spartan architecture's commitment to uncomfortable simplicity. The tables were rough wood, the benches were hard, the lighting was probably minimal, especially in winter. There was no tablecloth, no decorative centerpieces, no effort made to create ambiance. It was functional space for functional eating, and that was it. The men would gather in the evening, after a day of military training or whatever other civic duties occupied their time. They'd take their places, and there was definitely a hierarchy here, with older men in positions of honor and younger men showing appropriate deference. The food would be served communally. The infamous black broth would make its appearance, accompanied by barley bread, some cheese, maybe some figs if you were lucky. Occasionally there would be meat, but not often, and when it appeared it was typically game that someone had hunted, not purchased meat, because purchasing luxury food items would violate the spirit of Spartan austerity. The eating itself was supposed to be moderate. Gluttony was weakness, remember, so taking more than your share or showing too much enthusiasm for food would be noted and judged. But eating too little might suggest you were trying to show off your asceticism, which would also be judged. There was a narrow, acceptable range of eating behaviour, and your dining companions were watching. Always watching. It's like having dinner with your most judgmental relatives, except it happens every night and they can vote to revoke your citizenship. Conversation at these dinners was expected to be serious and educational. Young men were supposed to listen to older men discuss military matters, civic issues, and Spartan values. There was probably some humour. Humans are humans, and even Spartans must have told jokes. But it would have been the kind of dry, sardonic humour that reinforces group values rather than challenges them. Stories about successful battles, tales of exemplary Spartan behaviour, cautionary narratives about what happens to those who show weakness or break with tradition. The Syssitia was a nightly seminar in being properly Spartan. But here's where it gets really interesting from a social control perspective. The Syssitia wasn't just about ensuring everyone contributed equally and ate together. It was a surveillance system disguised as fellowship. 15 men eating together daily for decades means everyone knows everything about everyone. You can't hide dissenting opinions. You can't privately harbour doubts about Spartan values. You can't develop individual quirks or preferences without everyone noticing. The Syssitian knew if you were drinking too much, eating too little, speaking inappropriately, showing signs of wealth, failing to show proper respect for elders, expressing dangerous ideas, and they could and would report these things. This is peer pressure elevated to the level of state policy. Your dinner companions weren't just friends or colleagues, they were your monitors, your judges, your constant evaluators. Every meal was a performance of proper Spartan behavior. Every conversation was a test of ideological purity. Every interaction was being assessed by men who had the power to make your social life miserable if you didn't conform. It's like if your co-workers could get you fired not just from your job but from your entire social class, and you had to have lunch with them every day knowing this. The formation of Syssitia groups was itself revealing. Young men would be voted into a group when they came of age, and the vote had to be unanimous. Every existing member had to accept the candidate. This meant that Syssitia groups were self-selecting for conformity. They accepted members who were similar to themselves, who shared their values, who wouldn't disrupt the group dynamic. This created echo chambers where particular interpretations of Spartan values would be reinforced within each group, but also created some diversity across different Syssitia. Some groups might be more militarily focused, others more politically engaged, others more religiously inclined. But within each group, conformity was expected and enforced. The Syssitia system also created interesting dynamics around social mobility and power. If you wanted political influence, you needed the support of your Syssitian. If you wanted to be elected to important offices, your dining companions' opinions mattered. If you wanted to lead military campaigns, you needed men who would vouch for you. The Syssitia became power networks, social capital made literal through shared meals. Your 15 dining companions could make or break your career, support your ambitions or undermine them through quiet social pressure. There's something deeply Spartan about turning dinner into a mechanism of social control. Most societies use meals as moments of relaxation, spaces for pleasure and family bonding and individual choice. Sparta looked at mealtime and saw an opportunity for surveillance, indoctrination, and enforcement of equality. It's characteristically efficient and characteristically soulless. Why let people enjoy their food when you could use that time to ensure ideological conformity? But we need to acknowledge that the Syssitia system probably did create real bonds. Men who eat together daily for 40 years will develop genuine friendships, shared experiences, mutual support networks. The system was controlling, yes, but it also created community. When you went to war, you went with men who'd shared thousands of meals with you. When you faced political challenges, you had a group who knew you intimately and might support you. When you grew old, you had companions who journeyed through life alongside you. The oppressive aspects and the genuine fellowship probably coexisted, as they often do in tight-knit communities built on shared hardship. The economic underpinnings of the Syssitia deserve more attention because they reveal just how carefully Sparta had engineered its social system. Each citizen's land allotment, his kleros, was supposed to produce enough to make his monthly Syssitian contribution with some surplus for his household. This meant that the Syssitia system and the land distribution system and the helot labour system were all interconnected. If any piece failed, the whole structure could collapse. Not enough helots? Your land doesn't produce enough. Can't make your contribution. You lose citizenship. Too many citizens lose citizenship. Your military power declines. Your military power declines. The helots might rebel. It was an interlocking system where every component depended on every other component, held together by force of tradition and constant vigilance. Now let's shift to something that seems unrelated but was actually deeply connected to the Syssitia's role in creating social cohesion: music. Specifically, military music, because the Spartans had developed an approach to warfare that was as much about auditory discipline as physical training. While other Greek armies charged into battle screaming war cries and generally making noise in the chaotic way that humans facing death tend to make noise, the Spartans marched to the sound of flutes. Yes, flutes. Those instruments we associate with peaceful meadows and classical music were, in Spartan hands, weapons of psychological warfare. The aulos, which is more like an oboe than a modern flute, double-reeded and capable of producing penetrating, somewhat haunting sounds, became the Spartans' signature military instrument. Before and during battle, aulos players would set the pace for the entire phalanx. They'd play specific marching songs called embateria, rhythmic pieces that synchronized thousands of men into a single moving unit. The entire Spartan army would advance at the pace set by these flutes, maintaining formation through sound rather than just through visual cues and shouted commands. Think about how strange this must have looked and sounded to their enemies. You're a Persian soldier or an Athenian hoplite, and you're facing the Spartans on the battlefield. You're amped up on adrenaline, probably scared, definitely loud, the way humans are before violence. And then you see the Spartan phalanx approaching. They're not rushing chaotically, they're not screaming, they're advancing in perfect formation to the sound of flutes, moving like a choreographed performance, like death dancing in synchronized steps. It's deeply, profoundly unsettling. Chaos you can match with chaos. But disciplined, musical inevitability, that's psychologically devastating. The Embateria themselves weren't wild or aggressive compositions. They were measured, solemn, even beautiful in a martial way. They sang of glory, of duty, of ancestors, of dying well for Sparta. They were hymns that transformed warfare from chaotic violence into ritual performance. The songs had been sung for generations. Young boys learned them in the agog, practiced them countless times, internalized them so deeply that by the time they faced actual combat, the music wasn't just external sound, but internal rhythm. When the flutes played, their bodies responded automatically, muscle memory taking over, fear subsumed into the familiar pattern of the march. This musical approach to warfare gave the Spartans several practical advantages. First, it maintained formation integrity. A phalanx is only effective if everyone moves together, shields overlapping, spears aligned. Visual coordination is hard in the confusion of battle, especially once the fighting starts and dust rises and ranks get disrupted. But sound carries. The aulus could be heard across the entire formation, providing constant rhythmic guidance. As long as you could hear the flutes, you knew the pace, knew when to step, knew that the men around you were moving in sync. Second, the music created psychological unity. When thousands of men move to the same rhythm, sing the same songs, advance as a single organism, it creates a sense of collective identity that transcends individual fear. You're not just one scared person facing death. You're part of something larger, something that has existed for generations and will continue after you're gone. The music reminds you that you're a Spartan, that Spartans fight together, that your ancestors did this and your descendants will do this, that you're part of an eternal tradition. It's identity reinforcement through rhythm. Third, the calm, measured approach unnerved enemies in ways that screaming charges didn't. If someone rushes at you screaming, that's scary but also comprehensible. They're hyped up, aggressive, human in their emotional display. But if an army advances in eerie musical synchronization, showing no emotional display, treating battle like a choreographed dance of death, that's alien. It suggests that these aren't normal men who fear death. These are something else, something trained beyond normal human response. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Sparta's enemies weren't just fighting soldiers, they were fighting a musical machine that didn't seem to experience normal human emotions. The training required to achieve this musical military precision started young. Boys in the agog learned the Embateria alongside their weapons training. They practiced marching in formation to the aulos, internalizing the rhythm until it became instinctive. They sang the martial hymns until the words and melodies were burned into memory. By the time they reached military age, they'd heard these songs thousands of times. The music was associated with every aspect of their training, with discipline, with success, with approval, with identity as Spartans. When they heard it in actual battle, it triggered all those associations, turning fear into automatic response, panic into practiced movement. The lyrics of the Embateria, from what we can reconstruct, were interesting in their focus. They weren't about individual glory or personal heroism, they were about collective duty, about the group, about maintaining formation and doing your part. They praised men who died in battle while holding their position, who never broke ranks, who valued the success of the phalanx over personal survival. They mocked men who ran away, who showed fear, who valued their individual life over Sparta's needs. Every song was a lesson in Spartan values, repeated until those values became the only way of thinking. There's something beautiful and terrible about turning warfare into musical performance. Beautiful because there's genuine artistry in that level of coordination, in the discipline required to march to rhythm under extreme stress, in the cultural sophistication of using music as military technology. Terrible because it's still about killing people, about training humans to move efficiently toward violence, about using art as a tool of death. The Spartans managed to make warfare aesthetic without making it less brutal, which is quite an achievement if you think about it. The connection between the Syssitia and the military music becomes clearer when you consider that both were about sublimating individual will into collective action. The Syssitia trained you to eat together, think together, judge each other together, become a social unit that transcended individual preferences. The Embateria trained you to move together, fight together, die together if necessary, become a military unit that transcended individual survival instincts. Both systems were about creating unity through constant practice, repetition, shared experience. The dinner table and the battlefield became parallel spaces where individuality was systematically eliminated in favor of collective identity. We should also consider the religious dimension of the military music. The Embateria weren't just tactical tools, they were also offerings to the gods. Singing as you marched into battle was a form of prayer, a way of demonstrating that you trusted in divine favour and were proceeding with proper reverence. Apollo, god of music and poetry, was particularly important to the Spartans, and the use of musical instruments in warfare was partly a way of honouring him. The flutes transformed battle from purely physical confrontation into religious ritual, another way that Sparta blurred the line between sacred and martial until they became indistinguishable. The practical logistics of battlefield music are worth considering. The Aulos players were presumably positioned to be heard across the formation, which means they were probably in exposed positions, playing instruments while arrows flew and javelins fell. This required musicians who were also warriors, or at least brave enough to stand in dangerous spots to maintain the rhythm that kept the phalanx together. There's something simultaneously admirable and absurd about risking your life to play the flute during combat, but that's Sparta for you, willing to die for collective synchronization. The Embateria also served a function before battle, during the long moments when armies faced each other, building up courage or intimidating enemies or negotiating or just waiting. The Spartans would sing together, not aggressively but solemnly, reminding themselves of their identity and purpose, while demonstrating their unity to their enemies. It was psychological warfare through choral performance, using harmony as threat. Other armies might have individual heroes shouting challenges or champions fighting in single combat. Spartans sang together, a massed choir declaring through song that they were a collective force, not a gathering of individuals. After battles too, the music played a role. There were victory songs, paeans thanking the gods, hymns honouring the fallen. Music bookended the entire experience of warfare, transforming it from secular violence into something closer to ritual performance. From the marching songs that brought you to battle, through the rhythms that maintained formation during fighting, to the hymns of thanksgiving or mourning afterward, music made warfare feel like an extended religious ceremony rather than chaotic. Slaughter. The question of whether this musical approach actually made the Spartans more effective fighters is difficult to answer definitively. They were certainly effective. Their military reputation was deserved. But was the musical discipline a cause of their effectiveness, or just a correlation? Did the flutes and songs actually make them better soldiers, or did they just add an interesting aesthetic to military prowess built on other factors like constant training and social pressure? Probably some of both. The music maintained formation, which was crucial for phalanx fighting. It also created psychological advantages through its unsettling effect on enemies and its unifying effect on Spartans. But ultimately, the effectiveness came from the total system, the training, the social control, the religious conviction, the economic structure, and yes, the music, all working together. The contrast with Athenian warfare is illuminating. Athens had music too. All Greek armies used some form of music, but their approach was different. Athenian soldiers were citizens who farmed their own land, who debated in the assembly, who went to theatre performances and philosophical lectures. They fought as individuals who happened to be working together, not as a collective organism. They didn't need the same level of musical coordination because they weren't aiming for the same level of synchronized unity. They were effective soldiers, but they remained individuals even in formation. Spartans used music to erase individuality, to create something more like a hive mind temporarily embodied in human form. The Syssitia and the Embateria, then, were two faces of the same project, creating collective identity that suppressed individual will. The Syssitia did this through daily shared meals over 40 years, creating social bonds and surveillance networks that made nonconformity nearly impossible. The Embateria did this through constant musical training that made synchronized military movement instinctive. Together, they produced Spartans who were more effective as groups than as individuals, who thought in terms of the collective before the personal, who had been conditioned from childhood to sublimate individual desires to group needs. The human cost of this system manifests in the small ways: the Spartiate who couldn't make his secession contribution because of a bad harvest, losing citizenship over economic bad luck. The young man who learned to march to music that sang of beautiful death before he was old enough to understand what death actually meant. The lifelong bonds formed over thousands of shared meals that were also surveillance operations. The aesthetic beauty of a phalanx moving in musical synchronization, hiding the reality that it was trained humans moving to kill other humans. The Spartans created a society where communal dining and military music became tools of social control so effective that they seemed natural, where the mechanisms of conformity were wrapped in fellowship and art until you couldn't tell where genuine. Human connection ended and systematic oppression began. The sun set after another day in Sparta, and the men gathered for dinner in their syssitia groups. The black broth was served. The conversations followed familiar patterns. The unspoken evaluations continued as always. Tomorrow they would train, and the flutes would play, and they would march in formation, and the songs would remind them of who they were supposed to be. The system perpetuated itself through these daily rituals, through the dinner table and the training ground, through shared meals and shared music, through bonds that were both genuine and coercive, through beauty that served brutality. And everyone called it fellowship, called it culture, called it tradition, never quite admitting that it was all just very sophisticated social control with a musical score. After discussing the social control mechanisms of communal dining and military music, we need to address what might be Sparta's strangest political innovation. They had two kings, not sequentially, like when one dies and another takes over. Simultaneously, two kings from two different royal families ruling at the same time, supposedly with equal power, definitely with equal suspicion of each other. It's like if modern countries decided that having one president or prime minister was too risky, so they'd elect two who would have to agree on everything, while constantly watching for signs that the other one was getting too powerful. Which sounds like a recipe for complete governmental paralysis, and yet Sparta made it work for centuries, mainly by ensuring that neither king actually had that much real power to begin with. The two royal houses were the Aegiads and the Eurypontids, both claiming descent from Heracles, because in ancient Greece, if you're going to claim royal legitimacy, you might as well go big and trace your lineage to a demigod. The Aegiads supposedly descended from Eurysthenes, one of the twin sons of Aristodemus, while the Eurypontids descended from Procles, the other twin. The story goes that Aristodemus died or was killed, leaving twin sons, and rather than fight over which twin should inherit, the Spartans decided both families would be royal forever. This is either Solomon-level wisdom or a solution that creates more problems than it solves, depending on your perspective and how the current kings were getting along. The practical reality of dual kingship meant that every major decision potentially required agreement between two men who had very good reasons to distrust each other. They were competing for prestige, for influence, for their place in history. One king's success could make the other look weak by comparison. One king's popularity could threaten the other's standing. They were partners in governance but rivals in legacy, which is exactly the kind of relationship dynamic that makes for either extremely careful cooperation or spectacular dysfunction. The system included various mechanisms to prevent either king from dominating completely. When Sparta went to war, which was often, given their military culture and constant need to intimidate the helots, only one king would lead the campaign. The other stayed home to manage the city and, more importantly, to make sure the absent king didn't somehow leverage his military command into a coup. It's a brilliant arrangement in its cynicism. You can have military glory or you can have political presence, but never both simultaneously. The king who stayed home could undermine the king who left. The king who left could win glory that made the king at home look inadequate. Nobody could accumulate too much power because the system guaranteed that power was always divided. Now let's talk about what these kings actually did, because king might conjure images of absolute monarchs with unlimited authority, and we need to adjust those expectations dramatically. Spartan kings had specific religious functions. They were priests who performed important sacrifices. They conducted rituals. They had special roles in festivals. This wasn't just ceremonial window dressing. Religion and politics were inseparable in ancient Greece, and the king's religious authority gave them real influence. But it also meant they were bound by religious protocols and interpretations that could be manipulated by others, which we'll get to shortly. The kings also had military authority. They commanded armies in the field, which sounds powerful until you remember that they commanded alongside ephors, who accompanied them on campaigns, ephors who could countermand royal decisions, ephors who were watching for any sign that the king was becoming too ambitious or too incompetent. Imagine trying to run a military campaign while being actively monitored by government officials who have the authority to overrule you and the incentive to catch you in mistakes. It's like trying to do your job while your harshest critic sits in the corner taking notes for your performance review. Not exactly conditions that inspire bold, innovative leadership. The kings received certain honours that sound impressive but were actually pretty limited. They got double portions at the Syssitia meals, which means they got to eat twice as much black broth as everyone else, a privilege that loses some of its appeal when you remember what they were eating. They had special seats at public events. They were honoured in ceremonies and festivals. When they died, they received elaborate funerals with extensive mourning periods. These were significant markers of status in a society that generally rejected status markers, but they didn't translate into actual political power. The real power in Sparta resided in two other institutions, the Gerousia and the Ephoret. The Gerousia was a council of elders, 30 men total including the two kings. To be eligible, you had to be over 60 years old and from a distinguished family. Members served for life. This council prepared business for the assembly, served as a high court for serious crimes including cases involving the kings themselves, and had significant influence over policy. 28 old men who'd survived decades of Spartan life, who'd proven their commitment to the system, who'd outlived the ambitious and the careless. These were the men who actually ran Sparta, not the kings who held hereditary titles. But even more remarkable than the Gerousia were the ephors, 5 annually elected magistrates who wielded extraordinary power. Any Spartiate could be elected ephor, and they served 1-year terms, which meant that power rotated through the citizen body in a way that was almost democratic, at least within the narrow confines of who counted as a citizen. The ephors oversaw the king's behaviour, accompanied them on military campaigns, could bring legal charges against them, could fine them, could even exile them. They were like a yearly audit that the kings had to pass, and the standards were strict. Here's where the system gets really interesting. The ephors had the authority to observe the sky for omens. They could declare that the gods were displeased with the king's leadership. They could use religious justification to override royal decisions. Remember that Sparta was deeply superstitious. They'd delay military campaigns because of unfavourable sacrifices. They'd cancel operations because the gods seemed angry. The ephors controlled access to divine approval, which meant they controlled one of the primary sources of legitimacy. A king might want to pursue a particular policy, but if the ephors declared the omens unfavourable, that policy was dead. And who gets to interpret divine will? The ephors. It's a beautifully cynical system. Wrap political control in religious authority, then put that authority in the hands of annually elected officials who have no long-term stake in protecting any particular king's power. The relationship between kings and ephors was necessarily tense. The kings were hereditary aristocrats from ancient bloodlines, who'd been raised to see themselves as special, chosen, divinely descended. The ephors were regular citizens who'd been elected for 1 year to keep those hereditary aristocrats in check. Every month, the kings and ephors would exchange oaths, the kings swearing to rule according to the laws, the ephors swearing to maintain the kingship as long as the kings kept their oath. It was a monthly reminder that royal power was conditional, that the ephors were watching, that stepping out of line had consequences. Let's look at some historical examples to see how this played out in practice, because theory and practice often diverge significantly. Cleomenes I, who reigned from around 520 to 490 BC, was an Agiad king who tried to expand his power and influence. He got into conflicts with the ephors multiple times, was accused of bribing the oracle at Delphi to support his political aims, and eventually fled Sparta after being declared insane. Whether he was actually insane or whether this was a convenient political judgment is debatable, but the point is that even a powerful and successful king could be brought down by the ephors and Gerousia working together. He supposedly died by suicide after being imprisoned, or he was murdered. Again, the details are unclear, but the message is clear. kings who got too ambitious didn't end well. Or consider Pausanias, who commanded the Greek forces at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, one of the decisive victories against Persia. He won glory, he was celebrated, he started acting like he was more important than just a Spartan king. He allegedly began wearing Persian clothing, adopting Persian customs corresponding with the Persian king. Whether he was actually plotting to betray Greece to Persia, or whether his enemies fabricated these charges to bring him down, is still debated by historians. What's not debated is that he was recalled to Sparta, put on trial, and eventually cornered in a temple where he was left to starve to death. Even a war hero king couldn't escape the system's checks on royal ambition. The dual kingship also created interesting dynamics around succession. When a king died, his eldest legitimate son inherited. Simple enough. But legitimate could be interpreted, and the Gerousia and Ephors had significant input into that interpretation. There are cases where younger sons were elevated over older sons because the older son was deemed unsuitable for various reasons. There are cases where disputed successions created political crises that had to be resolved by the council. The hereditary principle was in place, but it operated within a framework of collective decision-making that could manipulate succession for political purposes. The two kings rarely cooperated smoothly. Why would they? They were competing for the same scarce resource: prestige and historical legacy. In a society that valued military glory above almost everything else, kings wanted to be the ones leading successful campaigns, winning battles, demonstrating bravery. When one king was off winning glory, the other was home, watching someone else add to their legend. This created constant jockeying for position, constant attempts to undermine each other through political maneuvering while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. Sometimes this rivalry was managed through unspoken agreements. You lead this campaign, I'll lead the next one. We'll alternate and neither will complain about the other's decisions. Sometimes it erupted into open conflict that required the Ephors and Gerousia to step in and mediate. And sometimes one king was clearly more capable or ambitious than the other, creating an imbalance that everyone pretended wasn't there, while the more powerful king gradually accumulated informal influence that his formal title didn't grant him. The military role of the kings deserves closer examination because it reveals both the honours and the limitations of the position. When a king led an army on campaign, he had theoretical supreme command. He made tactical decisions, determined strategy, decided when to fight and when to retreat. But he did all of this under the watchful eyes of the Ephors who accompanied him, who could report back to Sparta if the king showed cowardice, incompetence, or excessive ambition. He also commanded alongside other officers, polemarchs, who were elected military officials, who had their own authority and weren't necessarily loyal to the king personally. Before every battle, the king would perform sacrifices to determine if the gods favoured engagement. This wasn't just religious theatre. The results of these sacrifices could determine whether battle was joined. And conveniently, the interpretation of sacrificial omens was somewhat subjective. A king who wanted to fight could find favourable omens. A king who wanted to avoid battle could find unfavourable ones. But he couldn't do this too obviously or too often without people questioning whether he was manipulating religion for personal purposes, which was a good way to get brought up on charges when he returned home. In battle itself, the king fought in the front ranks of the phalanx. This wasn't symbolic. Spartan kings actually put their lives on the line. It was expected, it was required, and failing to do so would destroy a king's credibility immediately. The king's bodyguard, 300 elite warriors, fought around him, but the king was still exposed to the same dangers as any other front-rank fighter. Many Spartan kings died in battle. King Leonidas at Thermopylae is the most famous example, but he wasn't alone. The system required that kings demonstrate physical courage personally, which meant they had to accept real risk. It's a clever mechanism. You want the glory of military command. You have to actually fight at the front where the fighting is worst. It prevented kings from being pure politicians who sent others to die while remaining safe. The religious functions of the kings connected to their military role in important ways. Kings performed sacrifices before campaigns, during campaigns, before battles. They were the intermediaries between Sparta and the gods in matters of war. But they shared religious authority with other priests and officials, and the Ephors could challenge a king's interpretation of divine will. It's like being the official spokesperson for God, except 5 elected officials can contradict you at any time, and claim they're actually the ones who understand what God wants. Not exactly a secure position of unquestioned authority. The kings also served as judges in certain specific cases, mostly involving family law and inheritance. But the Gerousia served as the high court, and the ephors had judicial authority as well. So the kings had judicial functions, but they were hemmed in by other judicial institutions that could override them. Sensing a pattern here? The Spartans were very committed to making sure their kings had titles and responsibilities, but not overwhelming power. The economic position of the kings is revealing. They received land grants supposedly larger and more productive than those of regular citizens. They received gifts and offerings from those seeking favour. They accumulated wealth in ways that regular Spartiates couldn't, partly because they weren't subject to the same restrictions and partly because being king attracted resources. But they couldn't be too obvious about this wealth without violating Spartan norms of equality. A king who lived too lavishly would be criticised for being un-Spartan, for embracing luxury, for betraying the values that made Sparta great. So even their economic advantages came with constraints. The fact that Sparta maintained this dual kingship system for centuries is remarkable. It's inherently unstable. Two men competing for the same position of prominence, neither able to dominate, both aware that the system is designed to limit them. In most places, this would lead to one king eliminating the other, or to the position of king being reduced to pure ceremony, or to constant civil war as each king's supporters fought the others. Sparta avoided these outcomes through sheer institutional force. The Gerousia and especially the ephors were powerful enough to keep both kings in check, to mediate their conflicts, to ensure that neither could accumulate enough power to break the system. But this stability came at a cost. Spartan kings couldn't provide bold leadership because bold leadership required accumulating power that the system prevented. They couldn't make quick decisions without consulting other authorities. They couldn't pursue long-term policies without navigating multiple competing power centers. The dual kingship, combined with the Ephyret and Gerousia, created a government that was extremely stable, but also extremely conservative and slow to adapt. Which was fine as long as the world around Sparta remained relatively static, but became a serious liability when circumstances changed rapidly. There's something almost modern about the Spartan political system when you look at it this way. They'd created a structure of checks and balances, of divided power, of institutional mechanisms that prevented any individual or group from becoming too dominant. They had hereditary elements, elected elements, lifetime appointments, and annual terms all mixed together. It's like a complex constitution designed by people who trusted nobody and wanted to make sure that institutional rivalry would prevent tyranny. The difference from modern systems is that they applied these checks so thoroughly that effective governance became nearly impossible, and they wrapped everything in tradition and religious authority to prevent adaptation. The contrast with other Greek monarchies is instructive. In Macedon to the north, kings had real power, they commanded armies, made policy, could actually govern. Philip II and his son Alexander the Great were able to pursue ambitious transformational agendas because Macedonian kings had the authority to do so. Spartan kings looked at Macedonian monarchy and saw dangerous concentration of power. Macedonian kings looked at Spartan dual kingship and saw a system designed to prevent effective leadership. Both were right. The question that hangs over the whole institution is, why maintain kingship at all if you're going to limit it so severely? Why not just abolish the monarchy and have the Gerousia and ephors run everything? The answer seems to be that the kings provided continuity, religious legitimacy, and a focus for military loyalty that elected officials couldn't quite match. The kingship was ancient, supposedly divinely ordained, connected to Sparta's founding myths. Getting rid of it would have been revolutionary change, and Sparta was allergic to revolutionary change. So they kept the kings but defanged them, maintained the form while draining the substance. The dual kings also served as useful figureheads who could be blamed when things went wrong. If a military campaign failed, the king who led it could be held responsible, fined, exiled, or worse. The ephors and Gerousia could claim they'd been overruled or misled. The kings absorbed criticism that might otherwise target the entire ruling system. They were, in a sense, lightning rods for discontent, positions that drew complaints and consequences while protecting the broader institutional structure. There's evidence that some kings resented their limited power and tried to expand it. There's also evidence that some kings were perfectly content with their ceremonial role. enjoying the honours and privileges without wanting the stress of actual power. The position attracted different personality types, and not every king was an ambitious political operator. Some were genuinely religious figures who cared more about performing sacrifices correctly than about accumulating political influence. Others were warriors who wanted military glory more than political power. The system could accommodate different types of kings as long as they didn't try to fundamentally break the constraints. The social position of the kings and their families also deserves attention. Kings married into important families, creating networks of kinship and alliance. Their sons were groomed from birth for eventual kingship, going through the agog like other boys, but with everyone knowing they were different, they were special, they would someday be king. This must have created complicated psychological dynamics. You're equal to other citizens in theory, you're going through the same brutal training, but everyone knows you're marked for a special destiny. How do you navigate that? How do you maintain the Spartan pretense of equality while being raised to eventually rule? The royal families also accumulated enemies. Every decision a king made potentially created resentment. Every rival for influence became a potential threat. The kings couldn't protect themselves through military force or personal power. That was precisely what the system prevented. They had to navigate through political skill, through religious authority, through careful management of relationships. It was exhausting, it was dangerous, and it never ended. Even successful kings had to worry about their successors being undermined by their own enemies. The question of what happened to failed or disgraced kings is telling. They could be exiled, like Cleomenes I. They could be killed, like Pausanias. They could be fined, demoted in practice if not in title, or socially marginalized. The system had multiple mechanisms for dealing with kings who didn't work out, and it used them. This meant that being king was never secure. You always had to prove yourself, always had to navigate carefully, always had to balance competing demands from Ephes, Gerousia, the other king, your own ambitions, and the requirements of tradition. The dual kingship also affected military effectiveness in interesting ways. Sometimes having two experienced military leaders was advantageous. They could command different theatres, split responsibilities, provide redundancy if one was killed. But it also created coordination problems and strategic inconsistency. One king might favour aggressive expansion while the other preferred consolidation. One king might want to pursue an alliance while the other opposed it. These disagreements had to be mediated by institutions that weren't primarily concerned with military effectiveness, but with maintaining political balance. The religious dimension of kingship kept coming up because it was genuinely important. Kings performed crucial rituals that others couldn't perform. They interceded with the gods on behalf of Sparta. They were sacred figures in ways that transcended their political roles. But this sacred status made them vulnerable to manipulation through religious interpretation. An ephor who wanted to stop a king's policy could claim the omens were unfavourable. A Gerousia member could argue that the king had offended the gods and brought divine displeasure on Sparta. Religion was both the king's source of special status and the means by which others could control them. The sheer longevity of the dual kingship, it lasted from Sparta's legendary founding until the Hellenistic period, roughly 700 years, suggests it served some important function despite its obvious inefficiencies. That function seems to have been preventing tyranny while maintaining traditional legitimacy. The Spartans were paranoid about any individual accumulating too much power. They'd rather have ineffective leadership than risk tyrannical leadership. The dual kingship, with all its checks and balances and limitations, embodied this paranoia in institutional form. But as we'll see when we get to Sparta's decline, this system that prevented tyranny also prevented adaptation. When circumstances changed, when new military technologies emerged, when economic pressures mounted, when the population of full citizens collapsed, the dual kingship and its associated institutions couldn't respond effectively. They were designed for stability, not for change. They excelled at maintaining the status quo and failed spectacularly at adapting to new realities. The sunset over Sparta found both kings attending to their various duties, one perhaps performing an evening sacrifice, the other meeting with his faction in the Gerousia, both aware that their positions were simultaneously exalted and constrained. Honoured and limited, powerful in theory but hemmed in by practice. They wore their crowns, but the crowns were lighter than they appeared, representing more responsibility than authority, more obligation than privilege. And the ephors watched, as they always watched, ready to step in if either king overstepped the carefully drawn boundaries. 2 kings, 1 iron will, except the iron will wasn't the king's own, but rather the collective determination of Sparta's institutions to ensure that no king would ever be strong enough to change the system that had created them, limited them, and would outlast them. It was stability through paralysis, continuity through constraint, tradition maintained by preventing the very leadership that tradition supposedly honoured. And everyone called it wisdom, called it the Spartan way, never quite admitting that they'd created a system where the highest positions came with the least freedom to actually lead. We've spent a lot of time discussing the various layers of Spartan citizen society, their brutal education, their communal dining, their dual kingship, their women's paradoxical freedom. But we've been dancing around the elephant in the room, or more accurately, the massive population of enslaved people who made all of this possible. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Everything about Sparta, the military training, the citizen equality, the artistic rejection of commerce, the elaborate political checks and balances, all of it was built on the backs of people who had no rights. No voice, no choice. Let's talk about the Helots, the invisible foundation that supported the entire Spartan system and lived under conditions that made ancient slavery look sophisticated by comparison. First, we need to understand the numbers, because the demographic reality of Sparta was absolutely insane. The Helots outnumbered the Spartiates by somewhere between 7-1 and 10-1, depending on the period and which ancient source you trust. Some estimates put it even higher. Think about that for a moment. For every full citizen warrior, there were 7 to 10 enslaved people working the land. The entire elaborate system of Spartan society, the agog, the syssitia, the constant military training, existed on top of a demographic powder keg that could theoretically explode at any moment. It's like building your entire civilization on top of a volcano, and then spending all your time developing elaborate rituals to make sure the volcano doesn't notice how outnumbered you are. Now, the Helots weren't exactly slaves in the way we typically understand ancient slavery. They weren't property that could be bought and sold individually. They weren't captured in foreign wars and brought back to work in workshops or mines. They were something stranger and arguably worse. They were an entire conquered population permanently bound to the land they'd once owned, forced to work that land for the benefit of people who'd conquered their ancestors. Most Helots were Messenians, from the territory west of Laconia that Sparta had conquered in a series of brutal wars during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Their grandparents had been free farmers and citizens. Now they were generational servants, and their grandchildren would be too, on and on with no prospect of change. The legal status of Helots was deliberately ambiguous, which gave the Spartans maximum flexibility in exploiting them. Helots were tied to specific land parcels, the kleroi we discussed earlier that were allocated to Spartiate citizens. When a Spartiate received his kleros upon achieving full citizenship, that land came with Helots who were required to work it. The Helots couldn't leave, couldn't refuse to work, couldn't own the land they cultivated. They were obligated to hand over approximately half of everything they produced to their Spartiate master. The other half they could keep for themselves, which sounds almost generous until you remember that they were doing all the work and keeping only half the product of their labour, while the Spartiate did essentially nothing except show up occasionally to collect his share. This arrangement was supposedly formalised into specific amounts. Some sources mention specific quantities of barley and wine that had to be delivered annually, which meant that in good years, the Helots might have surplus beyond their required. Contribution. In bad years, they still had to meet the quota, which could mean starvation. The system incentivized the Helots to be productive, since they'd benefit from their own labour beyond the fixed contribution. But it also meant they were trapped in perpetual subsistence agriculture, never able to accumulate enough wealth or resources to change their status, always one bad harvest away from disaster. The daily reality of Helot life was grinding agricultural labour. They worked the fields, tended the olive groves, managed the vineyards, raised livestock, maintained the irrigation systems, all the actual productive work that kept Spartan society running. They did this under surveillance, always aware that Spartiates or their representatives might be watching, always conscious that failure to meet production quotas or showing insufficient deference could result in punishment. It was labour without dignity, without reward beyond bare survival, without hope of improvement. Just endless work, generation after generation, maintaining the agricultural base that allowed Spartiates to spend their days training for war and eating black broth together. But the physical labor wasn't even the worst part. The Spartans had developed a comprehensive system of psychological terror designed to keep the Helots subjugated despite their overwhelming numerical superiority. Remember the crypteia we discussed earlier? That was just the most dramatic element. The psychological warfare started with something even more fundamental. Every year, when the new Ephors took office, one of their first official acts was to formally declare war on the Helot population. Not because the Helots had rebelled, not because of any specific provocation, just as a blanket annual declaration. We are at war with you, therefore killing you isn't murder, it's combat. Think about the implications of this for a moment. You're a Helot. You've done nothing wrong. You're working your land, trying to survive, maybe raising a family. And every single year, the Spartan government formally declares that you are an enemy combatant in a war you didn't start, don't want to fight, and can't win. This legal fiction meant that any Spartiate could kill any Helot at any time without facing murder charges. The annual war declaration created permanent open season on Helots, a constant reminder that their lives had no legal protection, that they existed at the mercy of people who'd systematically removed them from the protection of law. The restrictions on Helot behavior were extensive and designed to prevent any possibility of organized resistance. Helots couldn't bear arms, obviously, since an armed population that outnumbered you 7-1 would be problematic. They couldn't gather in large groups without Spartiate supervision. They couldn't travel freely beyond their assigned villages. They couldn't participate in any kind of political assembly or discussion. They were deliberately kept fragmented, isolated in their separate village communities, unable to develop the networks and communications that might enable coordinated resistance. It's social control through enforced atomization, making sure that the subjugated population remained a collection of separate individuals rather than a unified group. But here's where things get especially bleak. The Spartans weren't content with just suppressing Helot resistance. They actively humiliated Helots as part of their citizen education system. There are accounts of Helots being forced to get drunk at public festivals so that young Spartans could observe them and learn to despise drunkenness. Helots were made to wear distinctive clothing, typically dogskin caps, that marked their inferior status. They were required to show ritualized deference to any Spartiate they encountered. The message was clear. You are not just our servants, you are our inferiors in every way, and we will regularly demonstrate this to reinforce the social hierarchy and to train our children in the proper attitudes toward the lower orders. The psychological impact of this constant humiliation and terror must have been profound. You're working land that your ancestors owned, serving people whose ancestors killed your ancestors. You can be killed legally at any time. You're forced to perform degrading displays for the entertainment and education of your oppressors' children. You have no legal recourse, no political voice, no path to appeal. Every day is an exercise in swallowing anger and maintaining the appearance of submission because any other response could get you killed. It's not just physical slavery. It's systematic psychological degradation designed to break any sense of dignity or self-worth. And yet, somehow, the Helots maintained their identity. They remembered that they were Messenians, that they'd once been free, that their servitude was imposed rather than natural. This collective memory was dangerous to Sparta. It meant that Helots weren't simply accepting their status as natural and eternal. They knew things could be different because things had been different. This historical consciousness was precisely what made the Spartans so paranoid and so brutal in their suppression. You can't convince people to accept slavery as natural when they remember their grandparents being free. So you use terror instead of persuasion, violence instead of ideology. The threat of Helot rebellion wasn't theoretical. There were uprisings, though our sources for them are frustratingly vague. The most significant was the revolt that followed the massive earthquake of 464 BC, which destroyed much of Sparta and killed a significant portion of the Spartiate population. The Helots saw their opportunity and rebelled, and it took Sparta years to fully suppress the uprising. This event traumatized Spartan society. It proved that their worst fears were justified, that the Helots were indeed waiting for any sign of the weakness to rise up. The response was predictably brutal. More surveillance, more terror, more systematic violence designed to ensure that Helots would never again see rebellion as viable. But here's where the Spartan system reveals one of its characteristic contradictions. Despite all this oppression and terror, the Spartans sometimes needed Helot military service. When Sparta went to war against external enemies, they often brought helots along as auxiliaries, as support troops, even occasionally as fighters. This created a bizarre situation where the same people you were terrorizing at home were being asked to fight alongside you abroad. The Spartans managed this contradiction through a combination of close supervision and occasional promises of freedom. This brings us to the Neodamodes, a category of people who complicate our understanding of helot status. Neodamodes were helots who'd been freed, usually as a reward for military service. They weren't full citizens, they didn't have the political rights of Spartiates, but they were free from the land, free from their servile status, able to live with some dignity. In theory, this system offered helots a path to freedom through loyal service. In practice, it was vanishingly rare. The number of Neodamodes created over centuries was tiny compared to the total helot population. It was just frequent enough to maintain the fiction that freedom was possible, rare enough to ensure that it remained an impossible dream for almost everyone. The Neodamode system served multiple functions. It created a middle class between citizens and helots who were personally grateful to Sparta for their freedom and could be used for various purposes without conferring full citizenship. It gave helots in military service a reason to fight effectively. Maybe this campaign would be the one that earned freedom. And it provided the Spartans with a propaganda tool. See, we're not unreasonable. Exceptional service is rewarded. Your status isn't necessarily permanent. Never mind that exceptional service might mean fighting in multiple campaigns over decades and still being passed over for freedom. The possibility was technically there, which was the point. The economic relationship between helots and Spartiates deserves more examination because it reveals just how parasitic the Spartan system was. A Spartiate contributed nothing to the actual production of wealth. He didn't farm his kleros. Helots did that. He didn't manage agricultural operations. Helots and their overseers did that. He didn't engage in trade or commerce because that was forbidden. He just collected his share of what the helots produced and used it to make his Sicilian contributions and support his household. The entire Spartiate class was essentially living off inherited positions as landlords of land they didn't work, supported by people they terrorized. It's rentier economics at its most naked. The leisure and military training of the few made possible by the uncompensated labour of the many. This economic arrangement had consequences for both groups. For the Spartiates, it meant they were utterly dependent on helot labour continuing. Any disruption to helot productivity, rebellion, disease, flight, crop failure, directly threatened their ability to maintain citizenship through Sicilian contributions. They needed the helots, which paradoxically meant they needed to keep the helots alive and relatively healthy, even while terrorizing them into submission. You can't extract agricultural surplus from dead or disabled workers, so there was a baseline pragmatic interest in helot survival that tempered but didn't eliminate the violence. For the helots, the economic relationship meant they were trapped but not quite without resources. They kept half of what they produced, remember. In good years, with efficient work, that could amount to more than bare subsistence. Helots could have small accumulations of property, could improve their own living conditions somewhat, could even occasionally trade surplus among themselves. They weren't in a state of absolute deprivation. That would have been economically inefficient. They were in a state of controlled exploitation where they produced enough to sustain both themselves and their masters, with just enough retained benefit to make survival and compliance preferable to the risks of resistance. The geographical distribution of helots also mattered significantly. Most helots lived in Messenia, the western territory that Sparta had conquered. This meant they were somewhat removed from direct Spartiate supervision, living in their ancestral lands among people who shared their identity and history. This geographic concentration made the helots potentially more dangerous. They weren't scattered individuals, but communities with shared culture and memory. But it also made them somewhat easier to manage through collective responsibility. If one village caused trouble, neighbouring villages might be punished, creating incentives for communities to police themselves. The helots in Laconia proper, in the heartland around Sparta itself, were in a different situation. They were more visible, more directly supervised, perhaps more thoroughly controlled, but they also had closer proximity to Spartan power and potentially more opportunities for the kind of exceptional service that might earn Neodamode status. The system created different gradations of helot experience depending on geography, assigned task, and relationship with particular Spartiate masters, but the fundamental reality of servitude united all helots, regardless of these variations. The cultural life of Helots is almost completely invisible to us because ancient sources weren't interested in recording it. We know they maintained Messenian identity. We know they presumably had their own songs, stories, religious practices that weren't recorded by the Greeks who wrote history. We can infer that they developed forms of resistance that stopped short of open rebellion, work slowdowns, subtle sabotage, coded communications that Spartiates wouldn't understand. Every oppressed population develops these survival strategies. But the details are lost because the people recording history were the oppressors, not the oppressed. What we can say is that Helots must have developed sophisticated ways of maintaining dignity and hope under conditions designed to strip both away. They must have told each other stories about their free ancestors, taught their children to remember Messenian identity, even while performing the required rituals of Spartiate subservience, found small ways to resist, or at least to preserve their sense of self. The fact that Messenian identity survived centuries of servitude and immediately reasserted itself when Messenia was finally liberated in 369 BC suggests that Helot culture was resilient even under extreme oppression. The moral implications of the Helot system are worth stating explicitly because sometimes we get so caught up in analysing how systems worked that we forget to acknowledge that they were deeply, fundamentally wrong. The Spartans created a society where one ethnic group enslaved another, maintained that enslavement through systematic terror, and built their entire celebrated military culture on a foundation of generational oppression. They weren't ignorant of alternatives. They knew other Greek cities used different labour systems. They chose this approach deliberately because it served their interests, and they maintained it for centuries through brutal violence and psychological warfare against people who vastly outnumbered them. There's no redeeming this system through appeals to historical context or cultural relativism. Yes, slavery existed throughout the ancient world. Yes, ancient values were different from modern ones. But even by ancient standards, the Spartan treatment of Helots was notably brutal. Other Greeks commented on it. The annual war declaration was unusual. The cryptire was shocking even to people familiar with slavery. The Spartans were outliers in their systematic use of terror against their servile population, and they knew it. They did it anyway because it worked, because it maintained their power, because they valued their military training and citizen equality more than they valued not terrorizing hundreds of thousands of people. The comparison between citizen and Helot life throws the contradictions of Spartan society into sharp relief. Citizens ate black broth to build character, while Helots ate what they could after giving half their harvest to those citizens. Citizens trained in military discipline while Helots couldn't carry weapons. Citizens lived in austere equality with each other, while collectively oppressing a massive population that had no equality with anyone. The celebrated Spartan values, courage, discipline, equality, simplicity, only functioned within the narrow confines of the citizen class. Extended beyond that boundary, the reality was terror, exploitation, and systematic dehumanization. And yet, the system required constant maintenance. The cryptia operated annually. The war declaration happened every year. The surveillance never stopped. The restrictions on assembly and movement were constantly enforced. The public humiliations continued generation after generation. This wasn't a stable equilibrium that maintained itself naturally. It was a system that required active, ongoing violence and control to prevent it from collapsing. The Spartans couldn't relax, couldn't ease up, couldn't trust that the Helots had accepted their status. They knew at some level that they were sitting on a volcano. The question that haunted Sparta was, what happens if the Helots successfully rebel? And the answer was, Sparta ends. The entire system depended on Helot labour. Without it, the Spartiates couldn't maintain their military training schedule, couldn't make their secession contributions, couldn't sustain the political structure. They'd have to actually work for a living, which would mean less military training, which would mean declining military effectiveness, which would mean they couldn't suppress the Helots or defend against external enemies. The whole thing would unwind rapidly. This existential dependence on the very people they were terrorizing created the constant state of paranoid readiness that defined Spartan culture. The irony is that this paranoia, this constant militaristic readiness, this elaborate system of terror and control, it all made Sparta formidable, but also brittle. They were strong as long as the Helots remained subjugated, and the citizen population remained large enough to maintain control. But both of those conditions were vulnerable. The Helot population might rebel if given sufficient opportunity. The citizen population might decline for various reasons, and it did catastrophically, which we'll discuss in the final chapter. The system had no backup plan, no way to adapt to changing circumstances, no flexibility built in. It was optimized for one very specific set of conditions, and when those conditions changed, it collapsed. There's also the question of what this system did to the Spartans themselves. Living your entire life as part of a small minority terrorizing a vast majority does things to your psychology. The constant vigilance, the need to project strength and confidence you might not always feel, the knowledge that your lifestyle depends on systematic oppression, this creates a particular kind of person. Not necessarily a bad person in their individual relationships, but someone who's learned to compartmentalize, to not extend their moral consideration beyond their in-group, to see a huge portion of humanity as fundamentally different and therefore not deserving of the same treatment. The celebrated Spartan virtues were partially a response to this psychological pressure. You need courage when you're outnumbered 7-1. You need discipline when any weakness might encourage rebellion. You need unity when you're the minority. Maintaining control through force. The Helot system also explains why Sparta was so resistant to change and so opposed to expansion in certain ways. Taking more territory might mean incorporating more subjugated populations, which would worsen the already dangerous demographic imbalance. Allowing cultural or economic innovation might undermine the rigid control needed to keep the Helots suppressed. Engaging with foreign ideas might expose citizens to alternative models that questioned Sparta's approach. The system required totalizing control to function, which meant that any opening, any flexibility, any evolution was potentially threatening. Sparta didn't stay the same for centuries out of some admirable commitment to tradition. They stayed the same because the terror system required stasis to maintain itself. We should also consider the Helots who collaborated with Sparta, who became overseers of other Helots, who fought in Spartan military campaigns hoping for eventual freedom. These people were in an impossible position, betraying their own people for a chance at escaping servitude, serving the system that oppressed them in hopes of buying their way out, becoming complicit in the same brutality they themselves had experienced. The Spartans deliberately created these opportunities for collaboration, because collaborative Helots were useful tools for controlling other Helots, and because offering the possibility of freedom, even rarely realized, helped maintain the fiction that the system was based on merit rather than pure domination. The few Helots who did gain freedom as Neodamodes faced their own complicated existence. They were free from servitude but not full citizens. They had some rights, but not political participation. They'd escaped the worst of Helot status, but would never be fully Spartan. They existed in a liminal space, neither enslaved nor equal, their freedom always conditional, always dependent on Spartan goodwill. And their presence as visible examples of freed Helots probably made the enslavement of the remaining Helots psychologically easier for Spartiates to justify. See, freedom is possible for the deserving, therefore those who remain enslaved must not deserve freedom. It's moral logic that absolves the oppressor by implying that the oppressed could escape if they just tried hard enough. The emotional landscape of Helot life is almost entirely lost to us, but we can imagine it. The quiet rage that must have been constantly swallowed, the grief of seeing your children born into the same servitude, the fear of the crypteia, of arbitrary violence, of being singled out for showing too much strength or capability. The small consolations, a good harvest that left some surplus, a Spartiate master who was relatively less brutal, a moment of community celebration in your village when the overseers weren't watching. The tiny resistances, working slowly when you could get away with it, stealing small amounts, teaching your children to remember they were Messenian. All of this is speculative because the oppressed rarely get to write their own stories, but it's also humanly universal. People under oppression don't stop being human. They find ways to survive, to resist, to maintain dignity even in undignified circumstances. The Helot system stands as the essential truth about Sparta that undermines much of the romantic mythology. You can't separate Spartan military excellence from the enslaved population that made it possible. You can't admire Spartan discipline without acknowledging it was built on terror. You can't celebrate Spartan equality without noting it only existed among a tiny minority who collectively dominated everyone else. The black broth, The agoge, the syssitia, the dual kingship, the athletic women, the musical marches, all of it rested on a foundation of systematic oppression that Spartans maintained through calculated violence for centuries. The sun set over Messenia, over fields worked by people whose grandparents had owned them, whose grandchildren would still be working them under others' ownership, whose labour sustained a system designed to keep them permanently subjugated. Somewhere, helots gathered after the day's work, tired from labour that benefited their masters, teaching their children to survive another generation of servitude. Somewhere, young Spartiates planned their cryptaia service, learning to see these workers as threats rather than humans. Somewhere, an Epha signed the annual war declaration, maintaining the legal fiction that allowed murder without consequence. The system ground forward, maintained by terror and routine, by overwhelming force applied to overwhelming numbers, by a small minority's determination to maintain power through any means necessary. And history would remember Sparta for its warriors, for its discipline, for its unique culture, often forgetting or minimizing the hundreds of thousands of people whose stolen labour and terrorized lives made all of that possible. The invisible foundation that held everything up, acknowledged just enough to explain how the system worked, erased just enough to allow the mythology to survive. After examining the brutal foundation of helot labour that supported Sparta, we need to talk about another aspect of Spartan society that was equally instrumentalized and equally ruthless: religion. Because the Spartans didn't just militarize their education, their economy, and their politics, they militarized their relationship with the gods. In most ancient societies, religion provided comfort, community, and connection to the divine. In Sparta, religion was another tool for social control, another test of endurance, another way to reinforce the values of discipline and collective submission. The gods weren't there to love you or offer hope. They were there to judge your worthiness as a warrior, and to legitimize the state's authority over every aspect of your life. Now, before we dive into the specifics, we need to understand something fundamental about ancient Greek religion generally. The Greeks didn't have the kind of organized, doctrine-heavy religion that modern people are familiar with. There was no Bible, no centralized church, no priestly hierarchy that told everyone what to believe. Greek religion was fundamentally about ritual practice, doing the right actions, making the right sacrifices, honouring the gods through specific ceremonies at specific times. Belief was less important than behaviour. You could doubt the god's existence philosophically, as long as you still showed up for the sacrifices and followed the forms. Sparta took this practical, ritual-focused approach to religion and made it even more utilitarian. Every major religious observance had a clear political or military purpose. Every festival reinforced Spartan values. Every sacrifice served state interests. The gods weren't just honoured, they were enrolled in the Spartan system, divine employees of the military state, expected to do their part in maintaining order and discipline. It's like if a modern nation decided that all religious observance had to directly support military readiness and civic loyalty. No gentle hymns about love and peace, only prayers that the phalanx holds and the enemies break. Let's start with one of the most notorious Spartan religious practices, the cult of Artemis Orthia, which featured a ritual called diamastagosis. This was a ceremony where boys were whipped at the goddess's altar as a test of endurance. Not lightly whipped, not symbolically tapped. Actually whipped, hard enough that some ancient sources claim boys occasionally died from it, though that might be exaggeration for dramatic effect. The point wasn't to hurt the boys. Well, okay, hurting them was definitely part of the point. But the real purpose was to test whether they could endure pain without crying out, without showing weakness, without giving any indication that they were suffering. Think about what this means. You've got teenage boys, probably around 13 or 14, standing at a religious altar while adults whip them with reed switches or leather straps, and the entire community is watching to see who can take it without flinching. It's framed as religious devotion to Artemis, but it's really a public exhibition of the pain tolerance that the agoge has been building for years. The boys who cry out or try to avoid the whip are shamed. The boys who stand stoically accepting the blows without reaction are honoured. It's like if Sunday school involved corporal punishment as a test of faith, and everyone brought lawn chairs to watch. The ritual had supposedly ancient origins, possibly connected to human sacrifice practices that had been civilized into ritual beating. Some sources claim that in the distant past Spartans had actually sacrificed humans to Artemis, and the whipping was a milder replacement that still honoured the goddess's supposed bloodthirsty nature. Whether that's true or whether it's just ancient people making up darker backstories for current practices, "Oh, you think this is bad, let me tell you what our ancestors used to do," is hard to determine. What's clear is that by the classical period, the diamastagosis was a major event in the Spartan religious calendar, attracting spectators and serving as a key moment in a boy's progression through the agoge. But here's where it gets even weirder. By the Roman period, when Sparta was essentially a tourist attraction for wealthy Romans who wanted to see authentic ancient Greek culture, the diamastagosis had become a spectator sport. The Spartans built a theatre around the altar of Artemis Orthia so that more people could watch boys being whipped. Romans would travel to Sparta specifically to witness this exotic ritual, probably while making comments about how admirably tough the Spartans were or how barbaric the whole thing seemed, depending on their personal philosophy. It's like if a brutal tribal initiation rite became a UNESCO World Heritage Site and people bought tickets to watch. The Spartans, characteristically, were happy to maintain the tradition and monetize it for tourists. Discipline as performance art, suffering as spectacle. Now let's talk about the Gymnopediae, a festival that combined religious observance with public displays of athletic endurance and military training. The name literally means something like Festival of Naked Youths, which should give you some idea of what was involved. For several days in the height of summer, and summer in the Peloponnese is hot, we're talking temperatures that would make modern people immediately seek air conditioning. Young men would perform choral dances and athletic displays in the main plaza, completely naked under the full sun. This wasn't comfortable choreography. These were military dances, mock combat movements, displays of stamina and coordination that went on for hours. The youths would be singing as they danced, performing hymns that celebrated Spartan values and military victories. Older men would also participate, demonstrating that Spartan fitness was supposed to last throughout life. The entire community would gather to watch, and the performances were judged not just on skill but on endurance, who could keep going without showing fatigue, who maintained form as exhaustion set in, who demonstrated the kind of physical superiority that made Sparta feared throughout Greece. The religious aspect was tied to Apollo, god of music and poetry and a major deity in Spartan worship. But this wasn't Apollo, the refined artist bringing culture and beauty to humanity. This was Apollo, the patron of military discipline, Apollo who demanded perfection, Apollo who expected his worshippers to prove their worth through suffering. The festival honoured him by showing that Spartans could endure physical extremes while maintaining coordination and rhythm. It's worship as ordeal, prayer through pain, connecting with the divine by proving you can handle brutal conditions without complaint. The Gymnopediae also served social functions beyond religion. It was a moment when the entire citizen body came together, when different age cohorts performed and watched each other, when Spartan values were reinforced through public display. The young men showed off for potential wives and their elders. The older men demonstrated that they hadn't gone soft. Everyone was reminded that physical excellence and endurance were central to Spartan identity. It was community building through collective witness of suffering, which is very on brand for Sparta. But perhaps the most important Spartan religious festival was the Carneia, a celebration honouring Apollo Carneos that lasted 9 days and involved the entire citizen population. This festival was so significant that it could delay military operations, which is saying something for a society as militaristic as Sparta. The famous example is the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, where the Athenians desperately requested Spartan military assistance against the invading Persians. The Spartans said, "Yes, we'll come help, but we can't leave until the Carneia is over because offending Apollo would be worse than letting Athens face the Persians alone." The Athenians ended up fighting without significant Spartan support and won anyway, which must have been awkward for everyone involved. "Sorry we missed the battle that saved Greece, but we had a religious festival scheduled, hope you understand." The Carneia involved processions, sacrifices, athletic contests, and military exercises, basically all the standard Spartan activities, but framed as religious observance. There was a specific ritual where young men would chase another young man who was designated as the grape cluster runner, and if they caught him, it meant good fortune for the harvest in the city. If he escaped, that was also acceptable, but meant different omens. It's like religious tag with implications for agricultural productivity and military success. Ancient peoples had interesting ideas about how the universe worked. The festival also involved the construction of 9 tent-like structures where groups of 9 men would feast together, a temporary parallel to the normal syssitia system, but specifically for the festival. Everything in the Carnia came in 9s, supposedly connected to the 9 Spartan districts or 9 Dorian tribes or 9 something. The ancient sources aren't entirely consistent, but the numerology was clearly important. The Spartans were taking a religious observance and structuring it with the same obsessive organizational detail they applied to everything else. Can't just have a festival, it needs to be mathematically structured and militarily organized. The fact that religious festivals could delay military operations reveals something important about Spartan psychology. These were pragmatic, rational military planners who could coordinate complex campaigns, manage logistics, execute sophisticated tactics. They weren't simple-minded or primitive. And yet they believed deeply that divine favour was real, that omens mattered, that offending the gods would lead to disaster. The combination of military sophistication and religious superstition seems contradictory to modern minds, but it was perfectly consistent to ancient Greeks. You plan carefully and train extensively because the gods help those who help themselves, but you also respect divine will because the best human planning means nothing if the gods are against you. This brings us to the practice of pre-battle sacrifices, which were absolutely crucial to Spartan military operations. Before any engagement, the commanding king would perform sacrifices, usually animals like goats or sheep, and examine the entrails or observe the way the animal died, or interpret other signs to determine if the gods favoured battle. If the omens were good, the army would fight. If the omens were bad, they might delay, reposition, or even abandon an operation entirely. There are multiple instances in Spartan military history where they turned back from campaigns or refused to engage because the sacrifices indicated divine disfavour. Now, the cynical modern observer might think, convenient way for a king to avoid a battle he didn't want to fight, just claim the omens were bad. And you'd be absolutely right that religious interpretation offered opportunities for political manipulation. A king could use bad omens to justify caution, or find good omens to justify aggression, depending on his actual military assessment. But the system had checks. Other people could observe the sacrifices, could challenge interpretations, could call out a king who seemed to be manipulating divine will for personal purposes. And crucially, the Spartans actually believed this stuff. They weren't just cynically using religion as cover for military decisions. They genuinely thought that divine favour or disfavour affected outcomes. There's a famous incident where King Cleomenes I was preparing to sacrifice before battle, and the animal leapt up from the altar and escaped. Everyone interpreted this as a terrible omen. Even the sacrificial animal was fleeing the coming battle. Cleomenes could have ordered another sacrifice, could have tried to reinterpret the signs, but instead he accepted the omen and withdrew his forces. Whether this saved his army from a disaster, or whether it was just superstition that prevented a possible victory, we'll never know. But it shows how seriously the Spartans took these religious signs, even when military considerations might have suggested otherwise. The priests who performed these sacrifices and interpreted omens had significant power, obviously. They could shape military and political decisions through their readings of divine will. But remember the ephors. They also had authority to observe signs and interpret omens. And remember our discussion of dual kingship? The kings performed key sacrifices, but they did so under observation, and their interpretations could be challenged. Spartan religion, like everything else in Sparta, was structured to prevent any single individual from having unchecked power. Even the gods' messages had to pass through institutional filters and competing interpreters. Religious festivals also provided one of the few times when helots could participate in public Spartan life, though in carefully controlled and often humiliating ways. Helots might be required to serve at religious feasts, to prepare sacrifices, to perform menial labour during festivals. They were included just enough to reinforce that they were part of the community, but in a subordinate role that emphasised their servile status. Religion became another mechanism for maintaining social hierarchy. The gods themselves were witnesses to and enforcers of the division between citizen and helot, free and unfree. Some religious rituals specifically involved helots in degrading ways. We mentioned earlier that helots were forced to get drunk at public festivals so young Spartans could observe the shame of intoxication. This was framed as religious celebration. Festivals involved drinking after all, but it was really public humiliation disguised as ritual. The message to young Spartans was clear. This is what happens when you lack discipline and self-control. Look at these people who can't handle wine, who lose dignity when intoxicated. Don't be like them. And the message to helots was equally clear. We can force you to debase yourselves for our educational purposes, and you'll do it because refusing would be even worse. The oracle at Delphi played a significant role in Spartan religious and political life, as it did for most Greek city-states. Sparta would send delegations to consult the oracle about major decisions, whether to go to war, how to interpret strange events, what to do about political crises. The oracle's pronouncements were taken seriously, though they were often ambiguous enough to allow multiple interpretations. There's a cynical reading where you note that Delphi's priests were politically sophisticated and gave answers that reflected current power dynamics and their own interests. There's also a believing reading where you accept that ancient people genuinely thought the oracle channeled Apollo's wisdom. Both can be true simultaneously. The priests might believe they were genuinely inspired while also being influenced by political considerations they weren't fully aware of. Sparta supposedly had a special relationship with Delphi, and many of their social institutions were attributed to Delphic approval. The lawgiver Lycurgus, whose historical existence is debated, supposedly received divine sanction for his reforms from the oracle. Whether this actually happened or whether later Spartans invented this story to give their customs divine legitimacy is unclear, but the effect was the same. Spartan traditions weren't just human customs, they were God-approved institutions that couldn't be questioned without impiety. It's brilliant political theology. Make your social system divinely ordained and suddenly reform becomes blasphemy. The Spartans also worshipped Ares, god of war, which is unsurprising for a militaristic society, but their Ares worship was notably different from other Greeks. They didn't see Ares as chaotic, bloodthirsty violence. That was the kind of undisciplined warfare they despised. Their Ares was disciplined military force, war as organized state function, controlled violence in service of political goals. They transformed the god to match their values, or claimed their values matched the true nature of the god. Either way, even their war god had to fit into the Spartan system of discipline and control. Female deities were also important in Sparta. We've mentioned Artemis, but there was also significant worship of Athena, Helen of Troy, who was deified and worshipped locally, and other goddesses. This makes sense given that Spartan women had more public presence than women in other Greek cities. The religious sphere was one place where women could participate actively, perform rituals, hold priesthoods, exercise forms of authority that weren't available in the political sphere. But again, this wasn't because Sparta was enlightened about gender. It was because having women involved in religion served state purposes and didn't threaten male political dominance. The physical sites of worship reflected Spartan architectural simplicity. The temples weren't elaborate marble structures with intricate decorations. The Sanctuary of Artemis. Orthia, site of the famous whipping ritual, was a modest building that was repeatedly rebuilt over centuries but never made particularly grand. The various shrines and altars scattered around Spartan territory were functional rather than beautiful. This was consistent with Spartan rejection of luxury, but it also meant that religious spaces didn't create the kind of awe and grandeur that other Greek sanctuaries did. You weren't supposed to be moved by beautiful architecture, you were supposed to prove yourself through painful rituals. Religious education was part of the agoge. Boys learned the hymns, the proper forms of prayer, the correct procedures for sacrifice. They memorized poetry that connected Spartan history to divine favor. They learned that the gods rewarded discipline and punished weakness, that proper observance of ritual was crucial to both personal and collective success, that religion and civic duty were inseparable. It was theological education as military training, learning about the gods as part of learning to be an effective soldier and obedient citizen. The mystery religions and philosophical theology that were popular in other Greek cities had little presence in Sparta. These were individual spiritual paths that didn't necessarily serve state purposes. Sparta wasn't interested in personal enlightenment or mystical communion with the divine. They were interested in collective rituals that reinforced social bonds and military values. The elaborate theological discussions that Athenian philosophers engaged in would have been seen as pointless navel-gazing in Sparta. You don't need to understand the metaphysical nature of the gods. You just need to perform the proper rituals and accept that divine favor depends on military discipline. There's something deeply transactional about Spartan religion. It wasn't about love of the gods or spiritual fulfillment or existential meaning. It was about maintaining the correct relationship with divine powers so they would continue to favour Sparta in military and political matters. The gods were powerful entities that needed to be properly honoured through specific rituals, and in return they would provide victory, security and prosperity. If you failed to honour them correctly, they would withdraw favour and disaster would follow. It's religion as contractual obligation, prayer as payment for services rendered, worship as insurance policy. This transactional approach meant that when things went wrong, military defeats, natural disasters, internal conflicts, the explanation was always religious failure. We didn't honour the gods properly. We missed a ritual. We misinterpreted an omen. We failed to maintain the purity and discipline that the gods demanded. This framework prevented critical examination of whether Spartan systems might have inherent flaws. If we lost a battle, it wasn't because our military tactics were outdated or our enemies had innovated. It was because we'd offended the gods. If the economy struggled, it wasn't because our economic system was deeply dysfunctional. It was because we'd been insufficiently pious. Religion became a way to avoid confronting systemic problems. The calendar of religious festivals structured the Spartan year, creating rhythm and regularity in civic life. There were monthly observances, seasonal festivals, annual celebrations, and occasional special rituals for unusual circumstances. This constant cycle of religious activity reinforced community bonds and provided breaks from the routine of military training, though even the breaks were structured and purposeful, rather than truly restful. You weren't taking time off from being Spartan. You were being Spartan in a different, religiously focused way. The overlap between military and religious leadership is important to understand. Kings were military commanders, but also chief priests who performed crucial sacrifices. The Gerousia had religious as well as political authority. The Ephors could interpret omens and divine will. There was no separation between religious and secular authority, because Spartans didn't conceptualize that separation. The state and the gods were partners in maintaining order, and the same people who led politically and militarily also led religiously. It's theocracy, but not in the sense of priests ruling. Rather, it's a complete integration of religious, military and political functions into a single power structure. Foreign visitors to Sparta often commented on the religious observances, usually finding them either admirably pious or strangely excessive. The Spartans' willingness to delay military operations for religious festivals seemed either principled or stupidly superstitious, depending on the commentator's perspective. The painful initiation rituals were seen as either proof of Spartan toughness or evidence of barbarism. As usual with Sparta, outsiders couldn't decide if they were admirably committed to their values or just weird. The connection between physical suffering and religious devotion is worth dwelling on because it's so central to Spartan religious practice. Pain wasn't an unfortunate side effect of worship, it was the point. Proving you could endure pain without complaint was how you honoured the gods. The diamastigosis whipping, the gymnopaedii dancing under the burning sun, the various other physical trials that were framed as religious observance, all of these connected suffering to piety. The gods didn't want your love or faith or spiritual devotion in any emotional sense. They wanted you to prove you were tough, disciplined, capable of enduring hardship, religion as boot camp, worship as endurance test. This makes sense in the context of Spartan values. If the highest virtue is military courage, and military courage requires the ability to endure pain and fear, then religious rituals that test pain tolerance are preparing you for virtue. The gods aren't separate from the Spartan system. They're the ultimate enforcers of it, the cosmic authorities who demand the same discipline and suffering that the state demands. Heaven and earth both require you to shut up and take it without complaint. The psychological impact of this religious framework was probably significant. You're taught from childhood that the gods are watching, judging, assessing your worthiness based on your ability to suffer properly. You can't hide from divine observation any more than you can hide from your Sicilian brother's judgments. The gods become another layer of surveillance, another source of pressure to conform and perform. There's no space for religious doubt or spiritual questioning because that would suggest weakness, would indicate you weren't fully committed to Spartan values. You perform the rituals, you endure the trials, you accept the interpretations you're given, and you don't ask too many questions about whether this is actually what the gods want or just what the state claims they want. The afterlife beliefs of Spartans are less clear than their ritual practices. Ancient Greek religion generally had a pretty grim view of death. Everyone went to Hades, which was a shadowy, joyless place regardless of how virtuously you'd lived. There were exceptions for heroes and those favoured by gods, but most people just became pale shades existing in a dreary underworld. Spartans seem to have shared this general framework but added their own emphasis. Warriors who died in battle were particularly honoured, their names inscribed on monuments, their memory preserved in songs and stories. You couldn't avoid death, but you could control how you died, and dying heroically in service to Sparta was the best outcome possible. This created an interesting psychology around death. Death wasn't to be feared because everyone died eventually. What mattered was how you met death, with courage or cowardice, for Sparta or for yourself, maintaining discipline or losing it. The religious framework supported this. The gods honoured brave deaths, remembered heroes, punished cowards even in the afterlife. So you train yourself not to fear death, not because death isn't real, or because some wonderful afterlife awaits, but because honourable death beats dishonourable survival, and that judgment is eternal and divine. The Roman-era transformation of Sparta into a kind of theme park for ancient customs is worth noting because it shows how religious practices can persist as performance long after their original context has disappeared. By the time Rome dominated Greece, Sparta was a shadow of its former self, with a tiny citizen population, no real military power, and an economy based partly on tourism. But they maintained the diamastagosis ritual, performed it for Roman spectators, kept alive these brutal traditions that had once been genuine cultural practices. The religious forms persisted even after the society they'd been designed to support had collapsed. It's cargo cult religiosity, maintaining the rituals in hopes they'll bring back the glory, or at least because tourists will pay to watch. This raises the question, did the Spartans really believe all of this, or were they performing belief because it was socially required? And the answer is probably both, because belief is complicated and people can hold contradictory positions simultaneously. Individual Spartans probably range from true believers who genuinely felt divine presence in religious rituals, to cynics who saw it all as state propaganda but went through the motions anyway. But on a collective level, the society functioned as if the religion was true, made decisions based on omens and oracles, delayed military operations for festivals. Whether belief was authentic or performed didn't matter for practical purposes. The behaviour was the same either way. The integration of religion into every aspect of Spartan life meant that there was no secular space, no area of existence where divine authority didn't apply. Your education was religious. Your military service was religious. Your political participation was religious. Your economic contributions to the Syssitia had religious dimensions, even your athletic training connected to religious festivals and divine favour. You couldn't escape the gods' judgment because the gods were embedded in every institution, every practice, every value that structured your life. It's totalizing religion that leaves no room for religious pluralism or personal spirituality. There's only the state cult, and participation isn't optional. The contrast with Athenian religion is again instructive. Athens had elaborate religious festivals, yes, but they also had philosophical inquiry that questioned religious assumptions, drama that explored moral ambiguity, and a general cultural space for skepticism and debate. Sparta had none of that. Their religious culture was monolithic, unquestioning, entirely in service to state purposes. The gods existed to validate Spartan institutions and Spartan values. Any religious practice that didn't serve those purposes was irrelevant or suspicious. And yet, for all this religious structure and observance, Sparta produced almost no religious innovation, no theological developments, no philosophical engagement with religious questions. They preserved ancient rituals but didn't evolve them. They honoured the gods but didn't explore what that honour might mean beyond correct ritual performance. Their religion was frozen, like everything else in Sparta, held in place by tradition and fear of change. The gods wanted things done the old way, the Lycurgan way, the Spartan way, and any deviation was impiety. It's conservative theology taken to its logical extreme. The gods don't want innovation or interpretation or spiritual growth. They want exact replication of ancestral practices forever. The sun set over Sparta's temples and shrines, over altars where boys would soon be whipped in honour of Artemis, over the plaza where young men would dance naked under tomorrow's sun in service to Apollo, over the whole elaborate religious structure that existed not to bring comfort or meaning or spiritual fulfillment, but to reinforce discipline, test endurance, and validate the social order. The gods were watching, as they always watched, judging whether Spartans were maintaining proper discipline, proper suffering, proper submission to the system. And the Spartans prayed not for grace or love or salvation, but for victory and favour and the continuation of their peculiar way of life. Religion as state function, worship as obedience training, the divine enrolled in service to the military machine. It was piety, yes, but piety that knew its place in the system, that never questioned whether the gods might want something other than endless discipline and controlled violence. The blood on the altars was both literal, from countless animal sacrifices, and metaphorical, from the centuries of psychological violence done to young people in the name of pleasing, supposedly bloodthirsty gods. And everyone called it holy, called it necessary, called it what the gods demanded, never quite admitting that they'd created gods in their own image, demanding deities who required exactly what the state required, divine authorities who blessed the system that invented them. After examining every aspect of Spartan society, from the brutal education system to the religious rituals that turned suffering into piety, we arrive at the question that haunts every rigid system. What happens when circumstances change and you can't? Because that's ultimately what destroyed Sparta. Not a single catastrophic defeat, not a dramatic revolution, not an external invasion that wiped them out in one blow. Sparta died slowly, grinding to a halt under the weight of its own inflexibility, unable to adapt to a changing world, trapped by the very rigidity that had once been its strength. It's like watching a machine designed for one specific task encounter a completely different task and just keep trying to do the original thing until all the gears seize up and everything stops working. Let's start with the numbers, because the demographic collapse of Sparta is one of the most dramatic examples of how a society can systematically destroy itself through its own internal logic. At Sparta's peak, around 480 BC during the Persian Wars, there were approximately 8,000 full Spartiate citizens. That's not a huge number. Athens had far more citizens, but it was enough to field formidable armies and maintain control over the Helot population. By 371 BC, just over a century later, that number had dropped to around 1,500. By the 3rd century BC, there were fewer than 1,000 Spartiates, and by the time Rome was dominating the Mediterranean, Sparta's citizen population was in the hundreds. The society didn't just decline, it demographically imploded. The question is, why? Wars certainly took their toll. Spartan men died in battle regularly, and unlike other Greek cities, Spartans had strict limitations on who could be a citizen. You couldn't just grant citizenship to foreigners or freed slaves to replenish the population. You had to be born to Spartiate parents, go through the agoge, maintain your secession contributions, follow all the elaborate rules we've discussed. The path to citizenship was narrow by design, and there was essentially no way to widen it without fundamentally changing what it meant to be Spartan. But war casualties alone don't explain the demographic collapse, because other warrior societies managed to maintain their populations despite similar losses. The real problem was how the Spartan system itself prevented population growth and systematically excluded people from citizenship. Remember those secession contributions we discussed? If you couldn't make your monthly food contribution, you lost citizenship. As land became concentrated in fewer hands, and we'll get to how that happened, more and more Spartiates found themselves unable to meet their obligations. They'd fall from full citizen to hypomaion, losing all political rights and their place in the military system. They might still technically be Spartan by birth, but they weren't Spartiates anymore. The land concentration problem started with the inheritance system. Spartan law allowed property to pass through female lines, and women could own land independently. In theory, this seems progressive. In practice, it created massive problems for the Kleros system that was supposed to maintain citizen equality. When a Spartiate died without male heirs, his land went to his daughters. When a woman inherited land from her father and then married a man who also inherited land, that family suddenly controlled multiple plots. Over generations, this led to increasing concentration of land ownership in fewer families, including some very wealthy women who controlled substantial estates. Now, in a normal society, land concentration might create inequality, but wouldn't necessarily cause demographic collapse. But remember, citizenship required making secession contributions from your allocated land. If you didn't have enough land to generate surplus for those contributions, you couldn't be a citizen. As land concentrated in fewer hands, more families found themselves landless or land poor, unable to maintain citizenship. They couldn't participate in the syssitia, which meant they weren't full citizens, which meant they couldn't hold office or participate in political life or serve in the phalanx as regular soldiers. The citizen class was shrinking not because people were dying, but because they were being systematically excluded by the economic mechanisms built into the system. And here's where Spartan rigidity really showed its consequences. They couldn't fix this problem without changing fundamental aspects of their system. They couldn't grant new land because all the good agricultural land was already allocated. They couldn't let people buy their way back into citizenship with wealth, because that would violate the principle of equality and introduce corrupting commercial values. They couldn't lower the succession contribution requirements because that would be changing sacred tradition. They couldn't recruit new citizens from outside because that would dilute Spartan identity. They were trapped by their own rules, watching their citizen population collapse while being institutionally incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. There were some reform attempts. In the 3rd century BC, Kings Aegeus IV and Cleomenes III both tried to redistribute land and restore the citizen population to something closer to historical levels. Agis proposed cancelling debts and redistributing land to create more Spartiate families who could meet their obligations. It was radical reform aimed at saving the system by partially undoing the land concentration. The response from wealthy Spartans who benefited from that concentration, they had him executed, not exiled, not fined, killed. The conservative faction would rather see Sparta continue declining than accept reforms that threatened their property holdings. Cleomenes III tried a more forceful approach. He actually succeeded in implementing reforms, exiling his opponents, redistributing some land, and briefly increasing the citizen population. For a moment it looked like Sparta might adapt and survive. But the reforms required essentially overthrowing the traditional political system. He had to eliminate the ephorate, expand his own power as king, and force changes that violated centuries of custom. And even his reforms were limited. He couldn't solve the fundamental problems with the system, just patch some symptoms. When he was eventually defeated by Macedonian intervention, his reforms collapsed with him, and Sparta went right back to its slow decline. The story of these failed reforms illustrates perfectly why Sparta couldn't adapt. Any meaningful change required changing the core principles that defined Spartan identity, and changing those principles essentially meant becoming not Sparta. The society had built its entire self-concept around unchanging adherence to ancestral customs. To reform was to admit those customs were flawed, which was psychologically and culturally impossible for most Spartans. Better to maintain proud tradition while fading into irrelevance than to abandon tradition and possibly survive but as something different. Now let's talk about the military dimension of Sparta's decline, because the demographic collapse directly undermined the military power that had been Sparta's entire raison d'etre. With fewer citizens, Sparta could field fewer soldiers. The famous phalanx that had dominated Greek warfare required numbers. You needed enough men to form a deep, solid formation. As the citizen population dropped, the phalanx got smaller, shallower, less formidable. And unlike other Greek cities that could supplement citizen soldiers with mercenaries or allies, Sparta's military culture was built entirely around the citizen warrior who'd been through the agog. They couldn't just hire foreign soldiers to fill the ranks because those soldiers wouldn't have the training, the cohesion, or the Spartan identity that made the system work. This brings us to the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, which shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility so completely that the psychological impact was almost as important as the military defeat itself. For decades, other Greek cities had feared Sparta's military superiority. The Spartan phalanx was considered essentially unbeatable in conventional hoplite warfare. Kings and generals across Greece planned their strategies around the assumption that you didn't fight Sparta in a straight-up land battle because you'd lose. And then the Thebans, under their brilliant general Epaminondas, completely dismantled that assumption. Epaminondas did something tactically innovative that seems obvious in retrospect but was revolutionary at the time. He weighted his phalanx heavily on one side, creating a massive column of men 50 shields deep that smashed into the Spartan line like a hammer. The traditional phalanx was usually about 8 to 12 men deep, deployed evenly across the front. Epaminondas deliberately created an uneven formation that concentrated overwhelming force at the decisive point, breaking through the Spartan right wing where the king was positioned. King Cleombrotus died in the battle, along with roughly 400 Spartiates, a devastating loss for a society that probably only had 1,500 full citizens at the time. That's like losing a quarter of your entire citizen warrior class in a single afternoon. But the tactical defeat, brutal as it was, wasn't the worst part. The real catastrophe was what came after. Thebes and its allies invaded Messenia and helped the Messenians establish an independent state. Remember, Messenia was where most of the Helots lived, where the agricultural base that supported the entire Spartan system was located. Spartiates depended on Messenian Helot labour to generate the food surplus they needed for secession contributions. Without Messenia, without those Helots, the economic foundation of Spartan citizenship collapsed. Think about what this meant in practical terms. A Spartiate's land allotment might have been in Messenia. When Messenia became independent, he lost that land. Even if his land was in Laconia proper, he'd lost the broader economic system that made the land valuable. The freed Messenians weren't producing surplus for Spartan masters anymore. They were keeping everything for themselves, naturally. Spartiates who'd been barely meeting their secession obligations before couldn't meet them after losing Messenia. They fell out of citizenship, which further shrunk the citizen population, which further weakened the military, which made it impossible to reconquer Messenia. It was a death spiral. Sparta tried to reconquer Messenia. They launched multiple campaigns over the following decades, trying to restore their lost territory and Helot labour force. They all failed. The Messenians, now free and armed and organised, defended their independence successfully. They'd been waiting centuries for this moment, and they weren't going back to servitude. And Sparta discovered that without the overwhelming military superiority they'd once possessed, without the numbers to field dominant armies, they couldn't force reconquest. The system that had been built to maintain control over Messenia couldn't function without Messenia, but also couldn't reconquer Messenia without functioning. It's like a car that needs fuel to run but can't get to the gas station without fuel. The psychological impact of losing Messenia and failing to reconquer it cannot be overstated. For centuries, Spartan identity had been built around military dominance, around the idea that Spartan warriors were simply better than everyone else. The entire society, the brutal education, the austere lifestyle, the constant training, was justified by reference to Spartan military superiority. And then they lost, not just once, but repeatedly. The myth of invincibility was shattered, and with it went much of the ideological foundation that made the sacrifices of Spartan life seem worthwhile. Why suffer through the agog if it doesn't actually produce superior warriors? Why eat black broth and live in barracks and give up normal family life if the whole point was military effectiveness, and that military effectiveness demonstrably no longer exists? Why maintain rigid equality among citizens if that equality requires excluding most people, and the result is a tiny, weak city-state that can't protect its own territory? These questions didn't have good answers, but asking them meant questioning the entire Spartan system, which was psychologically difficult for people who'd been indoctrinated since childhood to believe that system was perfect and eternal. The military decline had multiple causes beyond just demographic collapse. Warfare itself was evolving in ways that didn't favour the Spartan approach. The phalanx tactics that Sparta had perfected were being innovated around by commanders like Epaminondas, who thought creatively about how to break the traditional formation. Cavalry was becoming more important, and Sparta had never developed strong cavalry forces because their whole military culture was built around heavy infantry. Siege warfare was becoming more sophisticated, and Sparta had neither the expertise nor the economic resources to conduct or withstand long sieges. Professional mercenary armies were becoming common, and Sparta couldn't compete in that market because they had no money and no commercial economy to generate money. The Macedonian rise in the 4th century BC made all of this worse. Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great revolutionized Greek warfare with the Macedonian phalanx, which used longer spears and different tactics than the traditional Greek hoplite formation. They integrated cavalry and infantry in new ways. They had professional year-round armies rather than citizen militias, and they had the economic resources of a large, wealthy kingdom backing their military machine. Sparta's citizen warrior model, which had been revolutionary in the archaic period, was now outdated. They were still training people to fight with equipment and tactics that had been effective 200 years earlier, while everyone else had moved on. And here's the thing, they knew they were becoming obsolete. It wasn't that Spartans were ignorant of changes happening around them. They travelled, they fought alongside and against other Greek armies. They saw the new tactics and technologies. They chose not to adapt because adaptation meant change, and change meant abandoning the traditions that defined them. It's the ultimate example of choosing identity over survival. Better to remain authentically Spartan and irrelevant than to compromise Spartan values and remain relevant. The political structure that we discussed earlier, the dual kingship, the Gerousia, the Ephoret, also contributed to decline by making coordinated reform essentially impossible. Any major policy change had to navigate multiple competing power centres, each jealous of its prerogatives, each capable of blocking reforms that threatened its interests. The system had been designed to prevent tyranny and rapid change, and it succeeded brilliantly at both. Unfortunately, preventing rapid change when circumstances demand rapid adaptation is a recipe for institutional death. The Spartan political system was perfectly optimized for stability in unchanging conditions and completely unsuited for response to crisis. By the Hellenistic period, when the successor kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's empire dominated the Greek world, Sparta was a shadow of its former self. The citizen population was measured in hundreds rather than thousands. The military was weak and largely irrelevant. The economic system barely functioned. The Helot population in Laconia was smaller and less productive. And yet the Spartans continued to maintain their traditions, continued to eat black broth and live in the same austere way, continued to put boys through the agauge, even though there were barely any boys left to train. This is where things get really strange. As Sparta declined in power and relevance, it became increasingly interesting to outsiders as a kind of living museum of archaic Greek culture. By the Roman period, wealthy Romans would travel to Sparta specifically to see the traditional rituals and customs that had largely disappeared elsewhere in Greece. They'd watch boys being whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia, observe the traditional dances and military displays, marvel at how these people still maintained customs from centuries past. Sparta became a tourist attraction, an ancient culture preserve where you could see authentic Greek warrior traditions that existed nowhere else. The Spartans, characteristically, seem to have leaned into this. They maintained and even exaggerated their traditional practices, performed them for Roman audiences, probably collected fees or gifts from wealthy visitors who wanted to witness exotic ancient customs. The diamastagosis whipping ritual, which might have become less extreme over time if left to natural evolution, was instead maintained and possibly intensified because it's what the tourists came to see. Sparta's identity as the keepers of ancient tradition became their main cultural export, their reason for continued existence in a world where they had no military or political relevance. This transformation from military power to cultural museum is simultaneously fascinating and sad. On one hand, there's something admirable about maintaining cultural traditions even when they're no longer politically useful. On the other hand, turning your society into a theme park version of itself where you perform ancient rituals for foreign tourists is pretty far from the proud warrior culture that had terrified the Greek world. The Spartans were literally performing Spartanness for audiences who saw them as curiosities, living relics of a bygone age. It's like if descendants of samurai maintained samurai traditions purely because tourists wanted to see them, not because the traditions served any actual purpose in modern society. The Roman period also saw occasional attempts to revive Spartan power, usually backed by wealthy Spartans who wanted to restore something of the old glory. These revivals never amounted to much because the fundamental problems remained: tiny citizen population, no economic base, obsolete military system, complete inability to adapt to changed circumstances. You can't revive a society by putting on traditional costumes and performing traditional rituals if the underlying structural problems that cause decline haven't been addressed. But addressing those problems would require becoming something other than Sparta, which was unacceptable. So instead they had periodic bursts of nostalgia-driven revival attempts that went nowhere. There's a broader lesson here about the relationship between tradition and survival. Tradition provides stability, identity, continuity, all valuable things. But tradition that becomes inflexible, that can't adapt to changed circumstances, that values form over function, becomes a trap. Sparta's tragedy wasn't that they had strong traditions. Many successful societies have strong traditions. It was that they had elevated tradition to such absolute status that any change became impossible, Any adaptation became betrayal, any evolution became corruption. They'd created a society that could only exist in one specific form under one specific set of circumstances, and when those circumstances changed, they couldn't change with them. The irony that the reference material mentions is worth dwelling on. Sparta, which had built its entire identity around strength, discipline, and rigidity, was destroyed by its own rigidity. The very qualities that had made them formidable, the unwillingness to compromise, the insistence on maintaining traditional forms, the rejection of innovation and change, became the mechanism of their destruction. They were like a sword that's so hard and rigid that it shatters when stressed rather than bending. Flexibility isn't weakness, sometimes it's survival. But Sparta had confused rigidity with strength for so long that they couldn't recognize that strength sometimes requires the ability to bend. Think about the alternatives that were available. Sparta could have granted citizenship more broadly, incorporated the Perikoi and freed helots into the citizen body, creating a larger and more diverse but also more resilient society. They could have developed their economy, allowed commerce and trade, built wealth that could support professional armies and technological innovation. They could have reformed the land distribution system to prevent concentration. They could have adapted their military tactics to match contemporary developments. They could have done any number of things that might have allowed them to survive as something other than a living museum. But each of these changes would have required abandoning aspects of traditional Spartan identity, and they couldn't bring themselves to do it. The relationship between the Spartan example and modern societies is uncomfortably clear. Any system that becomes so rigid it cannot adapt to changed circumstances is doomed. Any culture that elevates tradition above all other values, including survival, will eventually face existential crisis. Any society that builds its entire identity around a specific set of practices and then finds those practices no longer work faces a choice: evolve or die. Sparta chose death, slow, grinding, multi-generational death, but death nonetheless. And yet there's something about Sparta that continues to fascinate. The story has been told and retold for thousands of years. Movies are made about Spartan warriors. Motivational speakers reference Spartan discipline. Military forces worldwide claim spiritual descent from Spartan virtues. The society that declined into irrelevance has remained culturally relevant in ways that more successful societies haven't. Why? Perhaps because there's something compelling about total commitment, even when that commitment leads to destruction. Perhaps because the Spartan willingness to suffer for their principles, however misguided those principles might have been, strikes something deep in human psychology. Perhaps because failure can be as instructive as success, and Sparta's failure teaches lessons that successful societies don't. But we should be careful about the lessons we draw. The popular image of Sparta tends to emphasize the discipline, the courage, the military excellence, all the qualities that we might admire or aspire to. The deeper examination we've done over these chapters reveals a more complicated and often darker reality. A society built on brutal child abuse, systematic oppression of a massive enslaved population, rejection of art and philosophy and everything. That makes life worth living beyond mere survival, and ultimately an inability to adapt that guaranteed extinction. Yes, they were disciplined. Yes, they were tough. But they were also trapped by their own system, unable to imagine alternatives, grinding themselves down over centuries through sheer institutional inflexibility. The final sunset over Sparta, not any particular historical sunset but the metaphorical final sunset of Spartan relevance, illuminates a city that looks much as it did centuries earlier. The simple buildings still stand. The rituals are still performed. Boys still go through something called the agoge. But it's all hollow now, performance without purpose, tradition divorced from function. The handful of Spartiates who remain still eat their black broth, still make their secession contributions, still maintain the forms of equality that once meant something when there were thousands of equals rather than hundreds. The gods still receive their sacrifices, the festivals still occur on schedule, and everything is exactly as it was, which is precisely why everything has become meaningless. The story of Sparta is ultimately a tragedy in the classical sense. The protagonist's greatest strength becomes their fatal flaw. The discipline that made them formidable became the rigidity that destroyed them. The traditions that gave them identity became the chains that prevented adaptation. The military focus that dominated Greek warfare became obsolete irrelevance. The equality among citizens that seemed progressive was built on extreme inequality with everyone else. The austere simplicity that they claimed as virtue was really just rejection of everything that makes human civilization worthwhile. And yet, for all its flaws and contradictions and ultimate failure, Sparta achieved something remarkable. They created a society so distinctive, so unusual, so committed to its own peculiar values that people are still talking about it 2,500 years later. They failed, yes, but they failed spectacularly, and in failing they taught lessons that success never could have taught. They showed what happens when a society optimizes entirely for one set of values, military power, at the expense of everything else. They demonstrated the limits of social engineering when that engineering is based on suffering and oppression. They proved that you can't maintain a rigid system forever in a changing world. These are valuable lessons, even if the cost of teaching them was the grinding extinction of an entire culture. So as we close this examination of Sparta, this journey through its dawn over the Eurotas Valley, through its architectural austerity, its culinary suffering, its economic absurdity, its systematic child abuse, its paradoxical women, its surveillance state dining, its musical death marches, its powerless kings, its terrorized helots, its instrumentalized religion, and finally its slow collapse into irrelevance. We're left with a question. What do we make of a society that was simultaneously admirable and terrible, innovative and rigid, successful and ultimately self-destructive? Perhaps the answer is that we shouldn't make any single thing of it. Sparta was complicated, contradictory, human in all its flaws and aspirations. The people who lived through the Spartan system, the citizens who believed in it, the helots who suffered under it, the women who navigated its paradoxes, the kings who tried to lead within its constraints, were all just people trying to live there, lives within the structure they inherited. Some benefited from that structure, many were crushed by it, all were shaped by it in ways they probably couldn't fully see. And eventually the structure collapsed, as all structures built on insufficient foundations eventually must, leaving behind ruins and stories and lessons for anyone willing to look closely enough to see what was really there. The sun has set over Laconia for the final time in our story. The flutes have played their last march. The black broth has cooled in its bowl. The boys have endured their final whipping at the altar. The helots have worked their fields and finally found freedom, centuries too late for most, but still freedom. The kings have ruled and been constrained and mostly been irrelevant. The rigid system that was supposed to last forever has bent, broken, and passed into memory. Sparta is gone, but the lessons remain, about the costs of rigidity, about the price of oppression, about what happens when a society values tradition over adaptation, when it chooses purity over survival, when it builds everything on a foundation of suffering and calls it virtue. And with that, dear listeners, we've reached the end of our journey through Sparta, from its military awakening at dawn to its twilight as a cultural museum. It's been a long night, filled with uncomfortable truths about a society that many people admire without understanding, that achieved things worth noting while doing things worth condemning, that lasted for centuries while sowing the seeds of its own destruction from the beginning. So rest well, knowing that you live in a time with central heating, comfortable furniture, food that doesn't require stoic endurance to consume, and societies that at least aspire to flexibility over rigidity. Dream peacefully, secure in the knowledge that no one is going to wake you at dawn to march to military flutes or force you to eat blood soup for breakfast. Sleep deeply, grateful that you weren't born into a system designed to turn every aspect of life into a test of endurance and obedience. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with everything Sparta rejected: art, philosophy, comfortable chairs, economic opportunity, the freedom to be an individual rather than a cog in a military machine, and the understanding that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is bend rather than break. Sweet dreams.